Chapter 7:12. As the son of the Federation's god of war, Lee Jae-do began to bear the glory and pressure of his family the moment he was born. As Lee Pifu went from being the Federation's war hero to the commander who defeated the 17th Division and then became the Federation's god of war, the glory and pressure he bore increased day by day. However, it was very regrettable that he had never been able to display the ability to match this glory and pressure on the battlefield. If it was another second-generation figure, under the pressure of this completely maddening sense of loss, perhaps they would have given up on themselves and even become crazy and indulgent. However, Lee Jae-do didn't. He very calmly accepted reality. After becoming a civilian, he started out as an ordinary instructor in the first military academy. Relying on his outstanding knowledge and excellent qualities, he gradually became an associate professor, dean, vice dean, and dean. Other than a very short period of military assignment, Lee Jae-do's military career was basically spent in the first military academy. Thinking about it carefully, today, countless young officers in the federal forces had received his teachings. General Lee Jae-do was extremely low-key. This was the common understanding of the Federation's political and military circles. However, being low-key didn't mean that he was incompetent. There was one point that was very worth pondering. Those military bigwigs who came and went from the Lees of Philadelphia, when he was young, none of them dared to look down on him. They were used to communicating with him with an equal attitude. This was related to his family background, but it was also because these military bigwigs of the previous generation who were gradually fading from the stage of history had long discovered that the marshal seemed to have never doubted his son's excellence and character. This kind of trust between a strict father and a young son was very rare. It was even shocking and thought-provoking. There were two military bigwigs in the federal military who were known for their gentleness and elegance. One was Minister of Defense Zhou Yingxing, and the other was Lee Jae-do, who was about to officially take over the position of chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the Federation. In a certain historical trajectory, the Federal Army, which was rapidly growing stronger with the war and gradually showing its autonomous will, should have entered the next era smoothly and gently under the control of the two big shots with scholarly demeanor. But now, it seemed that the reality was not so. The next day, the black coffin covered with military flags was transported back to Philadelphia by a special plane. Surprisingly, Lee Jae-do did not go back. Instead, he took a special car to the Army Conference Center in the northern part of the capital special district. The gendarme at the iron gate raised his gun to his chest and saluted the general. The general smiled warmly and stepped in, walking along the quiet and deep corridor of the conference center. He didn't sleep. He had been sitting beside the coffin all night, but there wasn't a trace of fatigue on his face. His dark green military uniform was straighter than ever, and as he walked forward, his footsteps became straighter and straighter. At this moment, he was like a man who had been carrying a mountain of millions of tons on his shoulders for many years, and suddenly relieved all the weight and began to walk forward with confidence. He was also like a weak man who had been silently standing beside his father for many years, and suddenly grew up overnight. In front of the tightly closed door of the conference room, Lee Jae-do gently pushed the door open. Seeing the familiar faces, he couldn't help but smile slightly. There were 7 people sitting in the spacious conference room, and any one of these 7 people was enough to affect the overall situation of the Federation in some way. The acting director of the Bureau of Proclamation, Choi Jedong, stood up, held his hand, and said softly and sincerely, "My condolences." The deputy commander of the 2nd Military Region also stood up and saluted with a bang. Everyone in the conference room stood up, and the last one was the fat old man who sat in the middle of the room. He slowly stood up, held Lee Jae-do's hand tightly, and said in a deep voice, "Please take care of yourself. Just as my father once said, for the sake of the Federation, we should exercise our bodies and strive for more years of healthy work." Lee Jae-do held his hand and said, "Mr. Vice President, I will always remember these words." These important figures in the conference room rarely had the opportunity to gather together. Over the years, under the name of that organization, they had only gathered in a hurry 2 or 3 times. Most of the time, they communicated with each other through their most loyal subordinates, meeting in person in some inconspicuous place. Time was very precious for these important figures. After expressing their most sincere condolences and sympathy to the old man who had just finished his funeral, they immediately got to the main topic. According to the 5-year plan, we have been trying to influence the third-level elections in the parliament, but the current situation is not very good. Those families and political factions have too much control over the parliament, and their power in the media is also quite shocking. Therefore, the candidates we have proposed have only made progress in the state and district level elections for the time being, and we have not been able to infiltrate the parliament at the management committee level. The important figure of the Federation Election Committee said in a deep voice, "Everyone, it seems that we need more patience to start from the seats in the parliament. The problem now is that those families seem to be vigilant, and we don't have enough time. Even if those old families are vigilant, with their arrogance, they will still not make a strong reaction, just like the situation in the West Woods and this investigation." Someone frowned and retorted, "Regarding that case, the Department of National Defense has been under pressure, and the Department of Justice probably won't be able to hold on for long. This is what I am most concerned about. It seems that Colonel Sue Lo has already given up on investigating this case. What else do we need to worry about?" The important figure of the election committee subconsciously glanced at the quiet General Lee Jae-do. Lee Jae-do did not speak, but picked up the teacup in front of him and took a sip. "The investigation by the Department of National Defense is not dangerous, but there is one thing I have to tell you. The archives of the association was invaded the day before yesterday, and it seems that someone is very interested in the things inside," Chui Judong suddenly said. "Who?" "The suspect now is Shi Qinghai, a spy from Green Dragon Mountain. He is very professional and did not leave any traces. If it were not for the GPS of the central computer chip, would not have any evidence." Chui Judong rubbed between his eyebrows and said tiredly, "I don't know how much this person knows, and who he is working for. The 4 branches of the anti-government army in Green Dragon Mountain are now in a state of disunity. Who would think of using the ancient bell to do something?" Several important figures in the meeting room did not have any impression of Shi Qinghai, but after being reminded, they remembered that this person had participated in the assassination of Macklin. Instead, Lee Jae-do, who had been silent all this time, looked at Vice President Byron and said with a frown, "This person is very close to Sue Lo. What should we do?" "Investigate him. If he is dangerous, then get rid of him." Lee Jae-do said simply, then lowered his head and continued to look at the relevant files. "As for why teacher Xiaoqing is not willing to participate, it is because of the empty sense of honor of a soldier. I will talk to him in person later." "Teacher Xiaoqing's loyalty to the Federation is unquestionable," Vice President Byron said with a heavy tone. Lee Jae-do slowly raised his head and said, "I don't agree with the change of cabinet members in the plan. Although the Department of National Defense is important and needs to be controlled, Minister Zhou should not be in the field. He is a talented person, and the war with the Empire needs his contribution. Besides, this will easily arouse the suspicion of that madam." Everyone in the meeting room thought about it and nodded slowly. "Minister Zhou may not be our comrade, but the Federation needs him." Lee Jae-do lowered his head and continued, "Everyone, we are not schemers. Especially when it comes to the fundamental interests of the Federation, we should even take the initiative to take a step back." "I agree with General Lee's position." Vice President Byron held the table with both hands and stood up with some difficulty. He rubbed his round belly in self-mockery and said calmly to everyone in the meeting room, "Everyone, we are not criminals who stop at nothing, nor are we businessmen who seek benefits at all costs. We are just people who want to do something practical for the Federation. The vice president's expression turned solemn as he said in a low voice, "In history, we may be branded with an ugly mark, and we may be frivolously criticized by those literati as radical martyrs of the blind son, but only you and I know what we are doing and why we are doing this. Everyone, a new era is slowly opening in front of us. The Federation is welcoming the best opportunity for change in history. What we need to do is to seize this opportunity for the Federation and not waver." Vice President Byron continued calmly, "And we do not need to waver. Right now, some people are saying that we need to be vigilant against the dark forces in the Federation government. Some people say that the so-called young and strong faction or radical faction has appeared in the army. In fact, these are all wrong. We are the Federation. We are the army. We represent the righteous tide of history. We are about to welcome a great victory for the common people." Westwood Sunset State, Old Mansion in Whaley 2 District. Zhong Huiyan, who was experiencing her first menstrual period, had completely lost the calmness that she had boasted about before. She curled up in a corner of the sofa with a thick blanket over her body. Because of the pain in her lower abdomen, her face was pale and pitiful. Only now did she know that she could not rely on books, knowledge, and intelligence to deal with every obstacle in life. The little girl was very flustered, and Su Lu, who had the thickest nerves in the universe, was not very calm either. Fortunately, Shang Qiu, who was on the phone at that time, heard the scream and then came to the old mansion of the Zhong family as quickly as possible under his pleading. At this time, Shang Qiu was busy in the kitchen. According to the professional habits of an engineer, she used a measuring cup to accurately cook the brown sugar water and used a caliper and her eyes to calculate the size of the female products the little girl needed. She arranged everything in a very orderly manner. After everything was settled, Su Lu carried Zhong Huiyan into the bedroom. The little girl, who was in pain and helplessness, held his hand tightly and refused to let go. She asked to tell the latest joke. Shang Qiu leaned against the door and carefully read the drug description under the corridor light. She listened to the man with small eyes clumsily tell the cold joke that even she could not bear to listen to. She could not help but smile slightly. "Brother, help me rub my stomach." Zhong Huiyan blinked weakly and looked at Su Lu. Su Lu put his hand into the warm quilt and gently rubbed the little girl's cold lower abdomen. After a while, he felt a warm body leaning against his back. The little girl cutely frowned and fell asleep. It seemed that in her dream, she blamed the unfairness of the Creator and the clumsiness of her brother. Isn't it a little too early? The bed in the little princess bedroom of the Zhong family was very large. Su Lu leaned against the bed and looked at Zhong Huiyan's slightly pale face. He said worriedly, "And I just found out that the first period can also hurt. It's normal at the age of 11 or 12. You don't have to worry too much." Shang Qiu, who was lying comfortably in his arms, yawned. After tossing and turning in the middle of the night, the two people fell asleep in a daze. The little girl in the quilt beside him twisted her body uneasily. In her dream, she subconsciously looked for Su Li's hand, then held it and refused to let go. On a certain day in the 72nd year of the constitutional calendar, there were probably many little girls like Zhong Huiyan who grew up overnight. There were also many people who gradually decayed under the yellow soil. Some people thought that they grew up overnight, but who knew whether they were decaying or not? Chapter 7:13. He was holding something soft in his hand. It was not accurate to say that he was holding it because it was too soft and tender. It was impossible to hold it with one hand. This feeling was very familiar. It was like, oh, there was no like. In fact, this wonderful tactile feeling could not be simulated by other actions. It was better to admit that the feeling of placing his palm on her round and plump chest was very good. In the sunshine, Su Lu slowly woke up. Before he woke up, a series of complicated thoughts flashed through his mind. He narrowed his eyes and looked at Shang Qiu in his arms. Looking at the girl's long eyelashes and tender mouth, he subconsciously panicked and slowly withdrew his right hand. Then he found that his left hand had been held by the little girl in the quilt all night. It was almost noon, and the three of them were sleeping soundly on the big bed. Shang Qiu was awakened by his movement. She rubbed her eyes and hair in a daze. She stood up and casually pulled down her short sleeves before walking to the guest room bathroom. For a girl with a proud figure like her, waking up in the morning wearing shorts and pulling down her short sleeves in a daze made her curves even tighter. It was undoubtedly a fascinating picture. So when Shang Qiu disappeared from the door, Sulu still kept his mouth slightly open and his eyes focused. "Is it nice?" a voice asked. Sulu subconsciously nodded and replied, "Yes." Then he found that the little girl beside him had woken up. He could not help but feel a little embarrassed. Zhong Huiyan patted her mouth and yawned. She looked innocent and cute. It seemed that the pain of menarche last night had passed and did not have any effect on her. She turned to look at Sulu and helplessly curled her lips like an adult. She sighed and said, "Last night I heard you on the phone upstairs. Are you going to have a baby?" "Ah." Su Li's attention was not turned to criticize her for eavesdropping. After a moment of awkward silence, he tried to explain, "We are in the engineering field. Our characters are a little strange, secular." "Please stop," especially the explanation after the secular. Zhong Huiyan looked seriously into Su Li's eyes and said in a low voice, "Do you men hope that any woman other than your wife will not be afraid of the eyes of the world and mess around with you?" Facing the little girl's sharp accusation, Sulu had no way to defend himself. He said in distress, "She was the one who suggested it. Looking at your distressed expression and the unconcealable joy, it seems that my view of men is not too problematic." Zhong Huiyan lifted the quilt and stood up in the sunshine. Then, she twisted her body to do the late morning exercise and continued, "But I remind you, it's best not to think about such a good thing. Although Shang Qiu's figure is exaggerated, her personality is actually very conservative. Most importantly, she likes you. Give birth to a baby. Don't even think about running away after giving birth to you. When the time comes, do you really think she will be satisfied and return to the engineering department of Harbor City to be an unmarried mother?" Sulu was once again rendered speechless by the little girl's mockery. Zhong Huiyan turned around and looked at him seriously. She said, "A woman is a woman. Whether she is the daughter of an aristocratic family, a national idol, or a genius girl, they only have one name in common: women." After a moment of silence, Sulu looked at the little girl and said very seriously, "My dear, what you said is very good. The people who got up late at night in the old house of the Zhong family in the second latitude district had to endure the discomfort caused by the high-speed sailing in order to get to a big state in the south in time to participate in the election rally that had already been arranged. The commanding heights around the election rally site had already been cleared by the special forces related to the West Woods military region. After all, this was the headquarters area of the Zhong family, so it was believed that no one would harm the little girl on the stage. It was already late at night, but Sulu, who was standing in the shadows under the stage, was still wearing his sunglasses. He held a 37 brand cigarette in his mouth and looked at the pretty Zhong Huiyan on the stage, who already had the feeling of a young girl. Listening to her using an innocent and lovely tone and using a tender and amiable expression to solicit votes for the pot-bellied old senator behind her, he couldn't help but laugh. The cigarette butt trembled between his lips. Then, he remembered the assassination attempt on the little girl in Wood Valley a few years ago. He thought of the powerful gunman with the surname Chin, and the man's military background. His eyes narrowed, and the cigarette between his lips suddenly burned faster. The general elections for the various star regions of the Federation were gradually unfolding. Tai Yuan was currently running for senator in the S2 Oak state. Every time he thought about how the thin and weak boy, who was younger than him, could actually become a real senator, Su Lu felt that this world was very absurd. The choice of the back of the mountain to let their young master start his political career from S2, a planet where the Federation held a strong position, was in itself a very strange thing. Su Lu believed that on this matter, the official residents had definitely given enough support. Everyone knew that President Pabre had a very large influence on the major Federation unions. The young Tai Yuan had only just started on his journey. It seemed that no one could stop the victory of President Pabre and his political faction in the Federation's higher-level political elections. His Excellency the President had the strong support of his wife and the military. Even those dangerous radicals didn't seem to oppose his re-election. In addition to his frighteningly high popular support rate, his re-election was unstoppable. These things seemed to have nothing to do with the Federation colonel in the darkness below the stage. Su Lu sucked hard on his cigarette like a greedy vagrant, puffing out smoke as he waited somewhat desolately. Speaking of which, this was probably the first time he had passively waited for things to change since he had enough power. For the sake of the Federation, this reason seemed to be sufficient. However, he waited silently. In the end, what would he be waiting for? The next day, Su Lu waited for the latest situation report from the old thing, the Charter Central Computer. He was somewhat surprised to find that the chairman of the Federation's Joint Chiefs of Staff, Li Jiedu, didn't return to Philadelphia with the old man's coffin. Instead, he directly took office and went to a certain military conference center to hold a high-level meeting. The problem was that the Federation's Vice President, Byron, and the Bureau of Proclamations Acting Director, Cui Zedong, also attended this meeting. It was very normal for the federal military's newest big boss to meet with the Vice President and the Bureau of Proclamations Director, especially when that person was Li Jiedu. Su Lu naturally didn't suspect anything or be overly vigilant. However, out of caution, he tried to once again request the Federal Central Computer to access the surveillance video or audio archive. According to the First Constitutional Court and the Federation's privacy regulations, I will not arbitrarily archive the relevant content. All the information and data are only mathematical tools for me to perform logical calculations, not objects for me to view. Your request has exceeded my authority. I'm sorry I can't comply with your request. Although he had heard similar answers many times, Su Lu still felt that it wasn't very helpful. He flicked his fingers and said to the old butler in his left eye angrily, "You can help me find out who met who through the historical data through the chip, but you can't tell me what they said when they met. What kind of privacy protection is this?" The files related to the privacy regulations have a total of more than 7,400 words. Do you need me to retrieve them for you? The old thing's reaction was extremely fast. Of course, its reaction should have been the fastest in the universe. I've already used all the points where your authority overlaps with the privacy protection of the citizens of the Federation. The rest of the requests are beyond your authority. There's really no other way. Then you said you could take me everywhere to peek at other people's baths. Su Lu threw away the cigarette in his hand and was extremely angry. The Federal Central Computer's answer was very calm, very mechanical, and very sarcastic. That's a joke. It seems that you really don't have a sense of humor. Su Li's chest was stifled by these words. After coughing a few times, he angrily said, "What the fuck are you laughing at?" This time it was the old thing's turn to be angry. The dazzling Federal Central Computer in the universe quickly replied in a sharp voice, "I've already violated my authority and directly carried out physical operations for you. What else do you want me to do? Break the privacy regulations today, and break the 3 laws tomorrow. Do you expect me to turn you into a god in this universe?" Su Lu lightly spat and said, "That's not bad." 7 days later, Su Lu waited for Shang Qiu, who had finished the experiment. The Sunset Province, which had already entered the beginning of autumn, finally had a refreshing taste. A white MXT mecha walked through the barren military zone, past the reddish canopy, across a small stream, and finally walked up to a small mountain peak. The heavy metal mecha slowly sat down, crushing the crisp rocks on the small mountain peak into pieces. Accompanied by the clear sound of electric current, the cockpit door leaned open. Sula walked out of the cockpit, his feet stepping on the inner wall of the cockpit door. Looking at the red evening sun that seemed to be hanging not far away, he lowered his head and lit a cigarette. Just before Shang Qiu arrived, he first received an order from the military. Without any warning, he was arranged to enter the heart of the Empire's star system and head to the X-3 system to take over a certain position at the level of a division commander. This assignment was very strange. Although it was a promotion of his rank, and although a soldier's duty was to obey orders, there seemed to be no reason for him to refuse a transfer order. However, Sula had very directly expressed his attitude over the phone that he definitely would not go. He did not know what the hidden meaning of this military assignment that clearly bypassed the Department of Defense was, but the new 17th Division was in S1, and the bunch of people in Group 7 were in S1. He was a soldier of the 17th Division and Group 7, so screw the division commander rank. Shang Qiu, who had just finished the MXT self-inspection program, also walked out of the cockpit. She held the metal frame above her head, looked at Su Li's back under the red sun, and said loudly, "If you don't obey the assignment, the other side can pin many crimes on you." Su Li shook his thighs, the cigarette in his mouth, trying to imitate a hooligan, but he couldn't. He still said righteously, "I plead not guilty." "Looks like you're in a good mood," Shang Qiu said with a smile as she tucked the wind-messed-up strands of hair behind her ear. Su Li took down the cigarette, squinted his eyes in the wind, and said, "What did they say on the phone?" Due to the tense situation at the front lines, the 1st Division was forced to make a very difficult decision. "Yes, they want to separate me and my unit further and further apart, so of course my situation will become more and more difficult. The most difficult thing is that I keep feeling that the air around me is becoming more and more sticky, as if something very scary is happening." He turned his head, looked at Shang Qiu quietly, and said, "So I can't go, at least not to the front lines now. I have to stay here and watch those people, or rather wait for those people." Chapter 7:14. It was early autumn, and the sun was red in the evening. The white MXT mecha was squatting quietly like a statue thinking about some philosophical problem. The hatch was still open. Sula sat on the edge of the alloy cabin wall, his feet hanging 5 meters in the air, like a naughty student sitting by the window on the 3rd floor of a school. His body was very relaxed, and it was hard to notice that he was holding a data cable without the rubber covering. Of course, there was also no way to see that there was chi flowing quickly in his body and gushing out from his right arm. Shang Qiu looked at his back under the setting sun, and her pupils could not help but shrink in shock. As an engineer, she could not understand the scene in front of her eyes. The thin leaves on the ground were swept up by the early autumn wind, and they whistled and flew in circles in the valley. However, when they reached the top of the MXD, they could not touch Su Li's body. About half a meter away, they twisted and fell and did not rise again. Su Li's body was constantly emitting some kind of heat. No, because he couldn't feel any heat, it should be some kind of energy. This kind of energy caused the rays of light from the red sun to appear abnormally distorted. Shang Qiu felt a little headache. She rubbed her forehead, lowered her head, and looked at the curve on the data display screen again. After a while, she shook her head and said, "There is a reaction. The unit cross-section charge anomaly is very clear, but it has no meaning for the transmission of information. It's just some clutter." Sula sighed softly, loosened his grip on the data cable, and raised his left arm to wipe the sweat on his forehead. "What's going on?" For a genius engineer, everything that she saw just now made Shang Qiu have a strong desire to research. She stared into Su Li's eyes and asked directly. I will slowly explain it to you in the future. Don't worry, there will be plenty of opportunities. I will do this kind of experiment many times, and I will not let other technicians monitor for me. Su Li smiled and said, as for this experiment, it was the old man who asked me to do it when he was in Philadelphia. As long as there was a chance to continue research, Shang Qiu was very satisfied. Thus, she did not say anything else and began to organize today's experiment data, preparing to first design a mathematical model. Su Li plugged the data cable back into the recessed socket, and listened to the familiar sound of the self-test. A happy and comfortable expression appeared on his face, and he patted the flat alloy plate beside him twice. The white flowers on the mountain peak responded with a crisp metallic sound. Due to certain matters, he had been feeling rather down recently. Only when he was with a mecha would he feel much more comfortable. This was probably because the MXT mecha he was sitting on could provide him with an almost invincible boost of confidence. Back in the day, the old man had been able to kill the Emperor of the Empire with just an MXT. Although I'm not that talented, with this MXT I'm sitting on, it shouldn't be too difficult for me to go to the capital special region and kill that Federation vice president if I go all out with this body of muscles. In fact, if it wasn't for the old man's last words, if it wasn't for the political pressure Mr. President was facing, if it wasn't for Minister Zhou's reminder, Su Li would have been in S1, continuing to investigate the case of the ancient bell. He would not have cared about where he was banished to or how much dirty water was splashed on him. No, it was not just the case of the ancient bell. There was also the murder in the underground parking lot of the Linhai State Gymnasium and the gunman in Wood Valley Manor. All the things he had experienced these past few years all pointed towards the dark and gloomy cloud hanging over the Federation. If that dark cloud had corroded all the machines of the Federation, then Su Li could only control the little white flower MXT under him to do some things. More than 10 MXT mechas were undergoing routine training in the southwest depression of the military zone. They belonged to the 4th Independent Team of the West Woods Military Special Mecha Brigade. During the break between training, these outstanding Federation soldiers looked at the eye-catching white MXT mecha on the mountain peak in the distance and fell into a heated debate. As pilots of the Federation military, they knew very well that the MXT mecha used the genius concept of the twin-engine turbocharger technology. Unfortunately, due to the large load, this type of powerful mecha could not be used to its full potential in the hands of a normal pilot. There were only 2 people in the military who could truly control the MXT mecha. These West Woods pilots were now arguing about which of these 2 people was better in terms of mecha combat. This question could also be understood as who was the strongest pilot in the Federation. Nowadays, no one mentioned the captain from a long time ago, Colonel Lake, who liked to wear sunglasses. However, some people mentioned the former captain, Hua Xiaoxi. Colonel Su Li was Captain Hua's instructor. You can imagine how high his level is. A West Woods pilot with a cigarette in his mouth said vaguely, "Of course Mad Manly is strong. After being a soldier here for so many years, he really is invincible in the military. However, that's in terms of individual combat. Speaking of mecha combat level, Su Li and Mad Manly once fought a match at the Old Moon base. Didn't you see the WikiLeaks video online?" The person beside him said unconvinced, "That's because the Federal Academy of Sciences Purple Sea is too fucking useless. It's not as good as the little white flower made of fruit shells." But don't forget, before the Purple Sea self-destructed, Colonel Su Li's little white flower was beaten into a pitiful little cabbage by Mad Manly. Mad Manly, that's the grandson of the war god. Speaking of tongue twisters, according to this, Colonel Su Li was personally chosen by the war god to be his successor. If Mad Manly is stronger, why didn't the war god choose his own grandson to be his successor? Why did he choose an outsider instead? That's not interesting. Colonel Su Li's traitorous teacher is the war god's younger brother. This relationship can't be that big. Su Lu, who was sitting at the edge of the White Flower MXT's cockpit door and smoking, did not know that many soldiers were excitedly discussing him in the distant depression. He only thought of the time when he was on the glacier battlefield in 5460 that was ravaged by a blizzard and electromagnetic storm a few years ago. He seemed to have also sat like this on the cockpit door. Lao Bai was beside him on a white MXT, while Shi Qinghai and a group of soldiers were standing on the snowy ground. Everyone took out cigarettes and held them in their mouths as they looked at him, waiting for him to extend the hot barrel of the MXT's mechanical arm to light their cigarettes. Such an interesting, warm, and manly military life. It had been a long time since he had relived it. Looking at the current situation, he didn't even know if he had the chance to return to the division. He waited and waited. If it didn't happen while he was waiting, then it could only happen while he was waiting. Did he really have to wait until the election was over, the president had won, and General Li Jiedu had complete control of the military situation before those cases could continue to be investigated? Su Lu didn't know if he could wait that long. The most important thing was that those people didn't seem to be prepared to wait any longer. Recently, he had already felt some strange and cold omens. His communication with the presidential palace and the Ministry of National Defense had suddenly become extremely difficult. It was as if some kind of invisible force was gradually exerting its power. In the spring of the 72nd year of the standard constitutional calendar, he was in the Westwood Sunset State. It was a very cold autumn. At that time, Colonel Su Lu definitely wasn't being pretentious. He was subconsciously using the mech Darlin's thick pipe to light a cigarette. What does this mean? It means that his microcontrol has reached an extremely terrifying level. It means that he is subconsciously extremely confident in his control of the mech. A few dozen tons of steel, and he is controlling it as if he is controlling his own body. Once again, this isn't being pretentious. This is truly awesome. Everyone at the scene was violently shocked. Among the Westwood's pilots who were training in the low-lying areas, there was a person who admired Su Lu very much. He waved his arms and exclaimed in admiration. There were at least 700 to 800 soldiers on the snowy slopes. All of them had cigarettes in their mouths, waiting for that white MXT to use the Darlin's thick pipe to light their cigarettes. You guys didn't see that scene. It was very impressive. Don't fucking brag. How did you see the cleanup operation between the 17th Division and the Special Forces Federation? Someone mocked. That pilot angrily explained, at that time, it was a frontline rotation. We were doing frontline practice. Our entire battalion was scattered and thrown onto the 5460. I saw it with my own eyes. This I can prove. We are from the same battalion. At that time, I was also in the north. The first pilot stamped out his cigarette and said, speaking of which, besides Madman Li and Colonel Su Lu, at that time in the glacier, we also met an awesome person. That person just now remembered something. He slapped his thigh and said, "You mean that liaison officer from Green Dragon Mountain?" That's him. Green Dragon Mountain Liaison Officer Shi Qinghai. The pilot was very emotional. He said, "This person is a Green Dragon Mountain bumpkin, and a civilian at that." In the end, he took away half of the 17th Division's face. That's an exaggeration, right? That's the 17th Division, someone said with a laugh. It's not an exaggeration. You guys should know about the 7th Division. Awesome, right? Awesome indeed. The pilot said loudly. At that time, there was a saying from the 7th Division. That Shi Qinghai is better with a gun than Xiong Linquan, fiercer than Magnolia in close combat, no worse than Gu Shifeng in electronic control, better than Ho Xiandong in battlefield first aid, faster than Lu Jiao in driving, and better than Lan Xiaolong in military school. Hearing this, the dozen or so Westwood soldiers by the stream were all stunned. Because of that documentary, the names and powerful combat abilities of the members of the 7th Division had long been recognized by the people and soldiers of the Federation. If the 7th Division really had such a high opinion of that man. Fuck, is he even human? From a certain point of view, Shi Qinghai was undoubtedly the most perfect man in the universe. He had received the most elite education in the Federation, and his excellent grades had allowed him to enter the Trinity Association. He had also been trained as a spy by Green Dragon Mountain's anti-government forces. His IQ was extremely high, and so was his EQ. He was also very handsome, with a pair of beautiful peach blossom eyes. He was gentle and courteous. If he wanted to, he could charm all the girls between the ages of 16 and 60. Except for a rich young lady who liked to wear red. According to the people of the 7th Division, Shi Qinghai seemed to be omnipotent. In fact, this feeling was very real, and even a little narrow-minded. Except for everything on the battlefield, there seemed to be nothing in life that this poor young master was not good at. Except for having children. In the past few days, Shi Qinghai felt a kind of joy that was very similar to the joy of having children. Because the investigation of the past few years was about to bear fruit, the kind that was heavy and heavy. This was going to be a beautiful autumn. Chapter 7:15. Killing people, cooking, torturing people, washing dishes, tasting fine wine after a battle, playing the piano after a trial, planting flowers, carving and painting. He could repair wood or steel into a flower, and he could also take a few glass test tubes and buy some common chemicals from ordinary stores. He could tinker with extremely high purity drugs. This kind of person would not starve to death. As a spy, he would definitely be the best spy. With ACW, he would definitely be the best sniper on the battlefield. If he retired from the army and entered the literary circle, he would definitely be the most popular star. If he wrote books, his works would definitely be the most popular. Even if he became a prostitute, he would definitely be the most expensive and best prostitute in the Federation. This was Shi Qinghai, Mr. Shi, a guy who came from a poor family but was exceptionally noble. According to conventional thinking, a person like young Master Shi should be living a happy life that ordinary people couldn't imagine. However, in reality, ever since he was a student, his life had been forced into darkness. That kind of loneliness, where he had no one to accompany him, was actually not very comfortable. Why did he choose this path? In the long letter to Sulu, he had mentioned it a little. It was because of his parents who died, because of the failed lawsuit, and some other reasons. The most handsome men in the literary circle were always found to be gay in the end. It was because it was too easy for them to find beautiful women. It was so easy that they were bored. Life always needed some challenges. Therefore, finding someone of the same sex to love, which was still a challenge to many people's views, naturally became a point that they subconsciously yearned for. That was it. Similarly, people who could easily live a happy and free life, and easily obtain material security, usually did not care much about material things. Instead, they focused more on spiritual pursuits. It should be noted that there were always two kinds of people in the Revolutionary Army, those who had nothing and those who had too much. The handsome revolutionary Shi Qinghai had been secretly investigating, especially after Sulu was exiled from the capital ring. He silently raised the issue. Although he had no feelings for the Zhong family in the West Woods, he was very interested in the people behind the scenes. Ever since the chubby teacher jumped out of the HTD bureau window and committed suicide, this interest had been strong and had not faded. Unless he caught or killed all of those people. After Du Shaoqing and his Iron 7th Division returned to the capital ring, he began to carefully collect intelligence in the periphery. He did not know when it started, but when he walked among the people in the streets and alleys in a hooded trench coat, he always felt as if someone was staring at him from behind. Shi Qinghai understood that this was an occupational hazard. As an intelligence officer, as he grasped more and more secrets and got closer to the truth, he felt that he could be killed at any time. Perhaps no one had discovered him, but this kind of nervousness could easily cause people to have illusions and even hallucinations in the end. Therefore, he increased his aerobic exercise and intake of lactic acid to reduce his anxiety. It was a pity that the sour soy milk in the apartment he rented for the past month did not taste good. Using a metal spoon to pick up the soy milk, Shi Qinghai muttered something unhappily. Wearing a tight sports vest, she looked at her reflection on the computer screen and couldn't help but be shocked. Why do I look more and more like an old woman who can't get married? In order to avoid seeing the sissy man wearing a headscarf, tight sportswear, and eating yogurt on the screen, he turned on the computer as fast as he could. Looking at the result on the screen, he put down the sour milk bottle in his hand in a daze. After a night of continuous cracking, the compatible assembly workbench finally opened the file. Shi Qinghai grabbed a few tissues and wiped the yogurt off his mouth. He quickly sat down in a chair, took out a cigarette, lit it, and put the cigarette case on the table. Looking at the eye-catching emblem at the top of the file, Shi Qinghai frowned and subconsciously looked down at the cigarette case. For many years, he had been used to smoking this brand of cigarettes. The first cigarette that he had passed to Su Lu through the iron gate was also of this brand. The cigarette case had 3 clear 7 written on it. The emblem on the computer screen was 3 clear 1. Trinity Association. For the more than 10 billion citizens of the Federation, the best high school in the Federation was the Capital University Affiliated High School. The most difficult high school in the Federation was the First Military Academy. Countless geniuses and top elites gathered in these 2 famous schools. If a student could graduate first from the Capital University Affiliated High School, enter the First Military Academy as the top student, and graduate first from the First Military Academy several years later, he would be able to enter the legendary Trinity Association. Compared to the clubs in the famous schools in Linhai, the Trinity Association didn't have a long history. However, its strict and even somewhat frightening entrance requirements gave it a mysterious cloak. Today, there were only a dozen or so members of the Trinity Association in the Federation. Most of them were quite old and held important positions. Many people in the military knew that the current famous General Du Shaoqing was a member of the Trinity Association. However, very few people knew that the Vice President of the Federation, Li Jiedu, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the Federation, was an old member of the Trinity Association. Shi Qinghai wasn't unfamiliar with the Trinity Association because he was one of the few people who had the qualifications to enter the Trinity Association. However, because he had gone to Green Dragon Mountain to receive special training, he had passed by that mysterious invitation letter. Later on, too many things had happened in his life, so he hadn't come into contact with this organization. If someone wanted to check the membership list of the Trinity Association, it wouldn't be difficult. In fact, if Su Lu hadn't given the exact times of those meetings, Shi Qinghai wouldn't have been able to link the dark forces in the Federation to this association. Looking at the list of words that quickly flashed by on the screen, Shi Qinghai frowned. He smoked a cigarette and didn't say a word. From the files, it could be seen that the Trinity Association's members had very few gatherings over the years. Moreover, the gatherings just happened to coincide with the times and places of the 3 so-called class reunions provided by Su Lu. What did this mean? Back then, you wanted to recruit this young master into the organization. Why is it so difficult for this young master to investigate a case now? Shi Qinghai muttered with a cigarette in his mouth. He complained bitterly about the Trinity Association on the screen. His fingers quickly tapped on the keyboard, shifting the focus of his attention from the stolen meeting itinerary to the related miscellaneous documents. When he was in his 2nd year of high school, he had already become a certified public accountant jointly issued by the 3 districts. He only needed to show proof of his academic qualifications to legally falsify accounts. In the end, he didn't embark on the criminal path of using numbers to deceive the rich of the Federation because he hated the shameful rules of being an apprentice for 1 year. However, with his solid knowledge, it was very easy to find clues in the Trinity Association's uncomplicated financial records. Shi Qinghai began to dig deeper from an account attached to an office. He rubbed his hands together excitedly, sat in front of another complex calculation workbench, and began to hack into the electronic system of the bank where he had an account. Because the account storage service was not a first-class protected object in the electronic system security system, Shi Qinghai, who had been collectively trained by the 3 computer experts of the military academy, the Federation Investigation Bureau, and the anti-government army of Green Dragon Mountain, didn't need to spend much time to find the answer he needed. Starting from the 61st year of the constitutional era, someone had rented 2 rooms in the apartment building across from the capital's special district building for a long time. Shi Qinghai had once heard this address from the middle-aged man who liked to wear gray sweaters under Macklin. He was stunned. He whistled softly and put out the cigarette. He pulled out the password disk from the armrest of the chair and inserted it into the workbench. He then connected to the Federation Investigation Bureau's secondary surveillance network database. He had left the Federation Investigation Bureau for many years, but in reality, he had never really left. The Federal Central Computer under the Bureau of Proclamation was required to protect the privacy of citizens. However, the Federation Investigation Bureau had never seemed to care about this, so he was able to find a lot of things. The apartment building was indeed right across from the building of the Ministry of National Defense, and the training center could be seen across the street. After the Linhai State Gymnasium incident, more than a dozen young officers of the 2nd Military Region committed suicide in this training center one after another. Shi Qinghai narrowed his eyes and stared at the video on the hologram like an eagle. He was calm, but he looked like he could pounce at any time. The secondary surveillance camera on the street quietly played the image of the entrance of the apartment building. A girl in red passing by in the spring, rolling leaves falling in the autumn, a handsome officer of the Ministry of National Defense with his cheating secretary, and an old citizen falling in the snow with crutches. The assassination in Linhai State happened during the New Year's concert in the 68th year of the constitutional era, so Shi Qinghai set the time to be before the 67th year of the constitutional era. He also chose to skip to random at 12x speed. Even so, it still played for a long time before he saw the middle-aged man in the gray sweater. "We meet again. Your kid is doing well." Shi Qinghai pressed the pause button and looked at the guy who was killed by his own bloody means. He rubbed his sore eyes and continued to search. He sat in front of the hologram of the computer for the whole night, watching the video. He didn't get bored, he didn't get irritated, he was calm and meticulous, and he didn't miss anything. When the sky gradually brightened outside the window, he finally saw the officer on the hologram. He walked out of the apartment building with his collar up and his shoulders shrunk. Through the corner of his military cap, he could faintly see the reddish-brown hair of the officer. Shi Qinghai's pupils shrank slightly. He lit a cigarette and put it in his mouth and took 2 deep puffs. Following the footsteps of the officer, Shi Qinghai quickly selected an area in the video database. It was as if he had returned to a few years ago, when he used the cameras all over the streets. He followed the steps of the officer again. Very fortunately, he did not get lost. He followed the officer all the way to the car, got off the subway, climbed up the hill, and then returned to an inconspicuous house. For the entire afternoon, no one came out of the house. Only in the evening did a black-haired officer silently walk out from the back door. Zooming in and sharpening the image, Shi Qinghai patted his face that was numb from lack of rest. He squinted at the face and greeted with a smile, "Hello, Shimin-jin." Chapter 7:16. A battered van was parked on the side of the grass. Shi Qinghai, who was wearing a gray hat, looked at the house across the street and subconsciously licked his dry lips. After lighting a 37 brand cigarette, he picked up the phone and dialed a number. "Who is it?" The other end of the phone was busy, like a market or something. "It's me." Shi Qinghai leaned against the car window, holding the cigarette with 3 fingers and swinging it gently. "Oh, what's up?" "I'm going in." "Go ahead." The other end of the phone paused and added, "Be careful." Shi Qinghai hung up the phone and crushed the cigarette. He carried the professional cleaning company's standard box, whistled, and walked to the house across the street with his head down. He glanced at the barbecue stall hundreds of meters away and couldn't help but smile. It might not seem too difficult to find the house that Shimin-jin used as a transit station, but in fact, it was quite difficult. Shi Qinghai used his skills as a certified public accountant, a computer expert, and a burglar to find this place in one night. As the old saying went, Mr. Shi was omnipotent, except for having children. He had been secretly investigating this case for many years, so all he needed to do was find the relevant evidence and hand it to the president's residence through Sulu. He didn't have to worry about the follow-up issues. As for what the Ministry of Justice or the district prosecutor's office would do, it was none of his business. The house in the grass was getting closer and closer. Shi Qinghai glanced at the thickness of the dust on the window lattice and confirmed that the stronghold had not been abandoned. He raised his eyebrows in the shadows and glanced at the barbecue stall hundreds of meters away. He was used to working alone, but because he was facing a senior officer of the Iron 7th Division today, he threw a wind chime outside the block for extra security. The wind chime was his subordinate in Green Dragon Mountain. The two had worked together for many years, and it was probably the only person in the world that he trusted besides Sulu. He quietly pushed the door open and quickly found what he needed. He also found the dust scattered in the crevices of the bed and the reddish-brown hair in the dust. It was very old hair. Even though the house had been swept many times, it was still stubbornly left behind. The decoration of this house was very simple, but the materials used were very expensive. As Shi Qinghai put on his gloves, he frowned as he sized up the environment of the room. He couldn't help but shake his head. He thought to himself that if a field officer could get so much allowance, the Federation would no longer need to send out money to recruit soldiers. After the matter was settled, Shi Qinghai didn't leave in a hurry. Instead, he whistled and really began to clean the room for Shimin-jin. He cleaned very seriously. He didn't miss a single corner. He clearly told the owner of the room that someone had been here. However, he completely cleaned up all traces. This kind of behavior was actually a bit arrogant, but the investigation of the past few years had finally come to an end, and he didn't need to do anything anymore. Shi Qinghai was in a very good mood, especially after seeing Shimin-jin's wine cabinet. More than a dozen of the most expensive wines of the Federation were displayed in the dark wine cabinet. Among them, there was his favorite brandy Campanile No. 3, Oak Pearl Red, and even a bottle of his favorite Qingshou hard liquor. Shi Qinghai took out the Qingshou hard liquor from the innermost part of the wine cabinet, poured it into a cup, and said with emotion, "I was wrong. If the officers of the Federation could get such a high allowance, we would have to worry about too many young people rushing to join the army. To my amazing self, to the tasteful Shimin-jin." After drinking the light blue wine in the cup, he sighed contentedly. After getting rid of the wine cup, he calmly turned around and left, just like a real cleaner. Shi Qinghai, who had more than 30 professional certificates, naturally had the judicial certificate of the Federation. Based on his legal knowledge and in-depth research of dozens of cases of the Federation, he confirmed that the evidence he had collected so far was enough for His Excellency the President and Sulu to send Mr. Byron and those angry middle-aged men to prison, and they would never be able to come out again. So he happily found a small wine glass, ordered a glass of wine, and began to relax and drink. He began to think about whether he should find a girl when he flew back to the south coast tomorrow, or continue to try to persuade Zuyu to take the child on a secret vacation together. Thinking about that minister's daughter, he frowned and shrugged his shoulders in self-mockery. After confirming that no one in the bar was paying attention to him, he took out his phone and dialed Su Li's number. Because the West Woods region was too far away, there was no way to guarantee instant communication like the 3 administrative planets in Xianglin. Shi Qinghai habitually laughed at Su Lu a few times, and then when he was about to get to the point, his pupils suddenly shrank, and his voice came to an abrupt stop. He thoughtfully stared at the transparent wine glass in front of him, gently licked his upper lip, and his left eyebrow arched like a mountain peak. His thin lips slightly raised, and he said, "The taste of this wine is really bad." He could clearly feel that the coating on his tongue was getting thicker and thicker, and he could faintly feel that there was a slightly salty taste between his teeth. It seemed like he was suffering from excessive heat, but in fact, it was not excessive heat. If this situation continued to develop, the bleeding symptoms at the root of his teeth would become more and more severe, and his taste buds would completely lose their function after 6 hours. Shi Qinghai stared at the transparent glass expressionlessly, confirming that the poison was not applied to the glass, but hidden in the green wine that he drank in that private house. The poison was called heterogeneous fairy. It was colorless and tasteless, and once it entered the human body, it would cause great damage to the nervous system and circulatory system. Moreover, because of the wonderful difference between the absorption speed and the onset time, it was very difficult to detect and reverse the effects. This kind of drug also had a very significant characteristic, and that was that it was unimaginably expensive. Just like his ACW. This was the knowledge that Shi Qinghai had learned in the first hospital, the Federation Investigation Bureau, and Green Dragon Mountain. However, he had never thought that someone would actually use such an expensive poison to kill him. "I was careless." He gently put down the wine glass, shrugged self-mockingly, and said, "And it was too wasteful." He took out the money and put it on the table. He seemed to be calm, but in fact, he quickly left the bar's front hall and walked into the kitchen, where there were not many people. He opened the refrigerator and took out a bucket of milk, grabbed a piece of ginger, and then went to the toilet. When he walked into the toilet, he could feel that his leg muscles had a tendency to relax, and the most troublesome thing was that his vision was obviously a little blurred. He picked up the milk bucket and gulped it down, then turned on the faucet and gulped down the clear water. He then ran to the cubicle, opened the door with force, and politely asked the waiter who did not have time to pull up his pants to leave. He looked down at the feces in the toilet and stuck his finger into his throat. With a wah sound, a mixture of clear water and milk was vomited out. Shi Qinghai did not straighten his body until he had vomited all the contents of his stomach and vomited out the disgusting yellowish-green gastric acid. He immediately stuffed the ginger into his mouth and chewed hard, letting the spicy ginger juice go through his severely injured throat and into his empty stomach. The pain instantly spread throughout his body. Shi Qinghai staggered out of the bar's back door. He raised his right arm, wiped the sweat on his forehead with the delicate sleeve of his suit, and staggered out of the alley, sticking close to the wall. In front of him, there seemed to be 2 drunkards tearing at something, and then they wrapped Shi Qinghai's body in a corner. Not long after, he heard 2 muffled thuds. The Federation agent who pretended to be drunk fell to the ground, blood gushing out of his body. He was holding a cold H pistol in his hand. Shi Qinghai combed his wet hair with his left hand and held the wet pistol with his right hand. He squinted his eyes at the tall building on the other side of the wall, knowing that the sniper was there. On a quiet street in the northern part of the capital special zone, flowers were swaying on the green field. Occasionally, a few weak petals would be blown off by the wind and roll slightly on the ground. It was a different kind of scenery when you came to a cafe on the street. In addition to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Lee Jae-do officially took over the position of commander of the 1st Military Region from General Miles at the end of last month. Today, he was still used to drinking afternoon tea in this cafe at the back door of a courtyard, as he had done many years ago, to let his busy brain rest for a while. However, his status was different after all. Fierce armed guards were watching from the side, so there were not many ordinary diners around the parasol. We just received the news that the target has already entered the rhythm. The director of the Special Forces of the Federation's 1st Military Region sat across from Commander Lee cautiously and reported in a low voice, "In order to avoid loopholes in the charter, we used a special fund to choose to use this drug. No antidote for this drug has been produced yet." General Lee Jae-do, who was wearing glasses, slowly raised his head, calmly looked at this loyal subordinate, and said in a low voice, "Do you need to report these details to me?" "Sorry, Commander." The director of the Special Forces stood at attention in fear, saluted, and left immediately. Most people in the association don't take Shi Qinghai seriously. They think that he is just a small figure, and they can't even remember his name. The acting director of the Bureau of Proclamation, Chui Zedong, gently stirred his coffee and said in a low voice, "But I never thought so. This is a very dangerous person. Knowing that he is going to die soon, I feel very relaxed." General Lee Jae-do didn't raise his head, and continued to read the newspaper quietly. "But I can't be completely relaxed. Even thinking about what may happen after Shi Qinghai's death, my heart suddenly became very heavy. How will Colonel Su Lu react? He directly refused the appointment to go to the Empire, which means that he has already felt something. He is in the West Woods, and it will only take him a few days to return to S1. Chui Zedong quietly looked at the brown liquid swirling in the cup and said, "Yes, Mr. Byron is right. We are the Federation, and we shouldn't pay attention to a natural person. But Colonel Su Lu is not an ordinary colonel. Don't forget, he has the first order authority of the Bureau of Proclamation." Chui Zedong raised his head, stared at General Lee Jae-do, and said, "As someone who has worked in the Bureau of Proclamation all my life, I have the responsibility to remind you and other people. According to the calculations in the past few years, I am sure that Colonel Su Lee's authority is even higher than Mr. President's. This is very scary. I don't want Colonel Su Lu to be too arrogant because of this authority, and thus walk on the wrong path. So I suggest that Director Chui should work from the inside, find out why the central computer gave him such a high authority, and find a way to remove his first order authority at any time. It will be very difficult." Chui Zedong's answer was very direct. General Lee Jae-do raised his head, looked away from the newspaper, and calmly looked at Chui Zedong, and said, "Well, if that day really comes, and if my speculation is not wrong, I will take charge of this matter." Chapter 717. Zhang Xiaomeng walked down the stone steps of Parliament Hill. She was still not used to wearing high heels, so her footsteps were quick. Outside of her black-rimmed glasses, there was a hint of worry between her eyebrows. As an important staff member of Green Dragon Mountain's anti-government forces stationed in S1, she had been working on Parliament Hill for a few years. Although the Federation's news media often interviewed her and called her the Leaf of Green Dragon Mountain, it was no longer as exaggerated as it used to be. No one knew that she had secretly taken over the work of the legendary intelligence leader for the past few years. "I don't care how dangerous it is. We have to find the two of them in the shortest time possible." Zhang Xiaomeng's expression was filled with worry and determination. She said into the phone, "This is an order." Just today, there were some puzzling waves in the deep sea of Green Dragon Mountain within the Federation. She was now the guardian of the deep sea, but she knew very well that there were some big fish in the deep sea that she could not control. For example, Shi Qinghai, who had always had a problem with her. But the problem was that the feedback from all the intelligence channels seemed to indicate that the waves were headed for that big fish. Sitting in the professional chair, Zhang Xiaomeng narrowed her eyes and stared at the street outside the window. In fact, she was staring at the transparent glass lens. The efficiency of the 4 departments of Green Dragon Mountain was indeed outstanding. In less than 10 minutes, the latest information was sent back. A row of characters quietly appeared in the middle of the black-rimmed glasses. Where is Shi Qinghai? Zhang Xiaomeng, wearing a gray windbreaker, took off the long gloves on her forearms. Her face was expressionless. She didn't even look at the person standing in the corner of the room. She said, I don't have much time. I hope you can hurry. 4 ordinary-looking men with pistols each controlled the passageways of the room. The middle-aged man who was forced to stand in the corner of the room was nothing special. There were some traces of barbecue sauce on his clothes and the smell of chopped green onions. I don't know what you're talking about. Zhang Xiaomeng calmly put the gloves into her bag and said, is he dead or not? Since she had already said so much, there was no point in insisting. The man who smelled like barbecue shrugged and said, he should be dead. There are no loopholes in the enemy's arrangement. Why? Zhang Xiaomeng looked at him and shrugged. She didn't understand and asked, why are you doing this? Why? The man who had just returned from the barbecue stall laughed nervously and said, we are all colleagues. He can go around picking up girls, but I can only make barbecue every day. He can do big things, but I can only do small things. The middle-aged man looked at Zhang Xiaomeng and said mockingly, do you know that I was the one who found his ACW? I was also the one who found his information. Why is he so arrogant while I can only be a good grandson and help him? If I remember correctly, Shi Qinghai is used to working alone. The only person he trusts is you, Feng Ling. Zhang Xiaomeng frowned, looked at the man in front of her and said, is this how you treat his trust? The man indifferently raised his head and did not speak. It was not until he saw the black muzzle that his breathing suddenly became rapid. The veins on his neck bulged as he shouted, you can't kill me. I'm the person in charge of the 4th section. Why can't I kill you? Zhang Xiaomeng asked expressionlessly as she held the small pistol in her hand. Bah, we risked our lives for the boss. Why should he give you such an important position? The man said in a hoarse voice, as for killing me, I didn't do anything. Why should you kill me? Zhang Xiaomeng shrugged. You betrayed your comrades and cooperated with the Federation government's agents. Do you need more reasons? The man looked at the black muzzle and his breathing became faster and faster. He finally gave up and said loudly, okay. Okay. I didn't expect your reaction to be so big and so fast. This matter is very simple. Shi Qinghai is a traitor. He has left the organization, so the committee has decided to cooperate with the government to eliminate him. The specific mission instructions are in my electronic pen. You can check them. I have direct authorization from the committee. If it wasn't for the confidentiality, I would have said it to scare you. Fuck. After saying this, the man angrily pushed away the pistol in front of him. He walked to the refrigerator and took out a water bottle. He drank in big gulps to relieve his previous nervousness and embarrassment. In the room, the 4 members of the Green Dragon Mountain's 4th section frowned and looked at each other. They did not expect that the old people in the committee would cooperate with the Federation government to deal with the strongest and most secretive big fish in the organization. You can leave first. Zhang Xiaomeng put down her arm and waved to the 4 subordinates. The man beside the refrigerator wiped the water droplets on his chin and looked at her with a cold smile. He said, don't be too impulsive in the future. Working people like us are like roasting eggplants. You can't rush things. Okay, I understand. Zhang Xiaomeng raised the gun and pulled the trigger. The delicate little handgun made a crisp popping sound. The middle-aged man fell down with an expression of disbelief. There was a delicate bloody hole between his eyebrows. The water bottle in his hand splashed everywhere. Clang, 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 clang. It finally fell on the remaining roasted eggplants and washed away the congealed green onions. Zhang Xiaomeng walked out of the door and dialed a number. The expressions of her subordinates did not change. It was as if they did not hear the gunshot in the room. They vigilantly walked around her and escorted her to the entrance of the alley. Sulu, something happened to Shi Qinghai. At night in the Army General Hospital, there was a faint and comfortable white light between each building. The past presidents and the recently deceased military god Li Pifu all left this world peacefully under the watchful eyes of the Army General Hospital's medical team. Bai Yulan's family, who had been in a coma for many years, was also in the intensive care unit of this hospital. In July, during the wildfire, Zhu gave birth to a son for Shi Qinghai in this hospital, although the father's name was Su Lu. Shi Qinghai did not know this detail, but he knew that this was the best hospital in the Federation, and that some of the military drugs he needed could only be found here. After killing the 6 Federation agents, he left the area. On the way, he changed into a new set of clothes and threw everything that could be implanted with a GPS chip into the underground sewer. Then, he quietly walked into the back door of the Army General Hospital. A faint blue light emitted from the magical little device and refracted in his jacket pocket. It did not penetrate the fabric, but it successfully escaped the strict GPS chip scanning and grading. According to the index of the hospital's inpatient department, Shi Qinghai struggled to move his legs and walked into a nurse's lounge. He leaned against the wall and breathed heavily. He knew that his opponent was from the Federation government, so he naturally could not use his real identity to register for treatment. And those black market hospitals with chaotic management did not have the ability to treat him, no, even if it was just to ease the invasion of the poison. The Army General Hospital treated the nurses very well. The night shift nurses all had their own private lounge. Shi Qinghai naturally did not know who the owner of this lounge was, but from the neat decorations and delicate decorations, he could tell that this was a girl who loved life very much. Shi Qinghai's face was pale, and the waxy yellow color on his lips looked very strange. He took a deep breath and tore open his new pants that were soaked in blood. Looking at the bloody bullet wound, he could not help but frown. Judging from the way the Federation agents acted, they should belong to the military, not the Federation Investigation Bureau or the Special Task Force. Most importantly, they were not afraid of death and had amazing combat strength. After Shi Qinghai was poisoned, he killed several people in succession, but in the end, he was hit by a bullet. At this time, the door of the lounge was pushed open, and a young nurse walked in humming a song. She was about to take off her pink nurse uniform and she suddenly found a strange man on her bed. Her delicate face suddenly changed color, and a few fine freckles seemed to fly along with her scream. However, there was no sound in the lounge, only silence. 1 minute later. "Don't be afraid, I'm a good person." Shi Qinghai slowly withdrew his index finger from the girl's lips and gently explained, "I know it's a bit abrupt, please forgive me, but there are some reasons I have to do." Maybe it was because Shi Qinghai was sitting so steadily that he appeared to be calm and open, or because his smile was so charming, like peach blossoms in the spring breeze, that no one would have the slightest suspicion of him. Maybe it was because his tone of voice was so gentle, like a willow tree gently brushing the surface of a lake. Maybe it was because Mr. Shi was so handsome that no one would believe that he was a bad person, and no one would believe that with his looks, he would need to rape someone. Therefore, the young nurse with a few cute freckles and a delicate face, although she was so scared that tears welled up in her eyes at that moment, miraculously, the scream that was about to escape from her mouth was sealed by a weak index finger, and her expression gradually became calm. "Hello, this is my ID. Shi Qinghai struggled to take out the ID from his jacket pocket, handed it to the young nurse, and said with a smile, "I belong to the 2nd Department of the Special Forces Combat Room of the 1st Military Region. I was injured in the course of a mission, so I came here." The young nurse confirmed that there was no problem with the ID, looked at him vigilantly and uneasily, and said, "Then I'll call the doctor for you." After all, she didn't dare to stay in a narrow and private space with a stranger, even if he was very handsome. The young nurse wanted to leave immediately because she didn't scream. But Shi Qinghai wouldn't give her a chance to leave. He covered his chest, pursed his thin lips, and said in a hoarse voice, "I can't register, I can't let anyone know, because I'm on a secret mission." The young nurse frowned, looked nervously at him and the clearly visible pistol behind him, and slowly stepped back. Shi Qinghai didn't seem to see her move at all, and continued in a low voice, "You have checked my ID, but my ID can't be used for registration, because that will expose my true identity. At the same time, the person I'm investigating has a considerable amount of power in the government. Doesn't this sound too ridiculous?" He suddenly raised his head, looked at her in confusion, and said, "Because it sounds too much like a line from a movie." The young nurse was startled by his raising his head, but after hearing this, she couldn't help but laugh. Then she became alert again, and her right hand, which was hidden behind her back, had already touched the doorknob. "It does sound ridiculous," Shi Qinghai said with a bitter smile. "Now, no one in the news media is reporting about this. People have long forgotten about it." "What is it?" asked the young nurse curiously. In fact, she was just trying to cover up her action of holding the doorknob. She was a girl who was a bit infatuated, but smart enough. "This doesn't need to be kept a secret." Shi Qinghai coughed painfully and put the pistol under the blanket in front of the young nurse, and said in a low voice, "I'm investigating a case in the West Woods, about the antique bell." After a moment of silence, the young nurse said, "Colonel Su Le once investigated it." "Yes, so he was expelled from the capital ring," said Shi Qinghai in a heavy voice, cursing his small-eyed boyfriend in his heart. "But I can't help you," the young nurse said firmly, "your wound is bleeding. I insist that you call the doctor to bandage it for you." "Young nurse, I chose you because I'm gambling with my life. You're the only one who knows about what happened to me in the general hospital. If anyone else knows that I lost the bet, I'll lose my life." Shi Qinghai looked at her seriously and said word by word, "If you insist on calling the doctor, then can you let me go?" The young nurse gently turned the doorknob. Looking at the handsome and charming officer of the Federation in front of her, she was a bit nervous and uneasy, not knowing what to do. Shi Qinghai's lies were indeed the key, but he had just said that he wouldn't give her a chance to leave, so he fainted. The young nurse looked at the unconscious man on the bed in shock. Seeing that his beautiful eyes were quickly dimming, she couldn't help but clench her fists tightly. She even forgot to turn around and leave point 10 minutes later. "Major, when I looked at the ID just now, there was only a citizen's number and no name. We're in the special warfare room. We often need to disguise our identities, so we change our names often." The young nurse's freckles on the bridge of her nose raised cutely. She looked at the door anxiously, then lowered her head and continued to stop the bleeding on Shi Qinghai's leg. She asked carefully, "May I know your name?" "The real one." Shi Qinghai leaned comfortably on the young nurse's bed and answered with a smile, "My name is Gongzi Shi." Gongzi. What a complicated name. The young nurse raised her head and looked at him with a smile, "Can I call you Old Gong?" Shi Qinghai narrowed his charming peach blossom eyes and answered very slowly with a smile, "Okay." The young nurse realized that there was something wrong with this name. She lowered her head shyly and didn't speak for a long time. When she finished bandaging the wound, she wiped the sweat on her forehead and stood up straight. She said, "It's just temporarily stopping the bleeding." We have to take out the shrapnel as soon as possible. Otherwise, there will be big trouble. Old Major Gong Zizi, if you can trust me, why can't you trust the doctors? As long as you tell them about the mission, they'll definitely be willing to help you. Doctors are very particular about rules. How can they allow me to not register? Besides, if I stay in the ward, I'll be discovered in the end. Shi Qinghai looked at her and said with a smile, Miss, can you allow me to stay in your room? The young nurse answered uneasily, but what about your wound? Can I trouble you to get some surgical instruments at night? Are you going to operate on yourself? Yes. Can you? Chapter 7:18. The pretty nurse had a very homely name, Huang Li, probably because her name sounded like a bird. Her voice was crisp and pleasant. There were a few playful freckles scattered around the tip of her nose. She didn't make any sound when she walked, making her feel particularly light and agile. She carried the lunchbox to the lounge and gently turned the doorknob. She cautiously glanced at the empty corridor behind her and quietly walked in. However, she didn't immediately go behind the curtain. Looking at the back of the man who was receiving an intravenous drip, she subconsciously covered her forehead. She didn't know what had happened to her. She actually took in this patient who came out of nowhere. Yes, there was no problem with Gong Zixi's military ID, but why did she make such a risky decision? Was it because of the impulsive desire for adventure in every girl's subconscious? Or was it just because this officer was too charming? Huang Li laughed self-deprecatingly. She lifted the curtain and walked in. She put the warm lunchbox on the table and checked the data on the electronic infusion pump. She somewhat cautiously sat down and asked, "Do you want me to bring an anesthetic pump?" "No, thank you." Shi Qinghai looked at her with a smile and pointed at the bullet wound on his calf. He said, "It didn't hit the bone, so there's no need for periosteal reduction. It won't hurt that much. By the way, here's the serum albumin and anticoagulant you asked for. There are also 3 heavy-dose tin tablets." Huang Li took out the medicine bottle from her bag and looked at Shi Qinghai in confusion. She asked, "Why do you want these things?" "I have a DVT." Shi Qinghai opened the bottle and began to take the medicine. He didn't say thank you, but he knew in his heart that it was very difficult to get these military drugs even in the Army General Hospital. The cute nurse in front of him could be said to be naive and gullible, but this was also a kind of pure and clean kindness. Deep vein thrombosis. Huang Li tried to recall the contents of the pharmacy elective course in the nursing department. Yes. You see, I can't wash the blood in my current condition, so I can only use medicine. Shi Qinghai frowned and resisted the burning sensation caused by the medicine in his stomach. After a moment of silence, he rolled up his sleeves and looked at her sincerely. He said, "Huang Li, can you help me test my blood?" "No problem. The electronic spectrometer is just next door." Huang Li smiled sweetly. She quickly took out a blood needle and a restraining belt and put them on Shi Qinghai's arm. Her slender fingers quickly rubbed his smooth elbow. "We may need to use a centrifugal pump." Shi Qinghai watched as the bright red blood slowly flowed into the small transparent bottle in her hand. He said somewhat embarrassedly, "I may need a whole set of protein decompression procedures, so I have to do a blood test." "I don't understand the protein decompression procedure." Huang Li took off the blood sample and looked at him. "What instruments and drugs do you need?" "I'll give you a list later," Shi Qinghai replied. Huang Li subconsciously covered her forehead again. Her light pink nurse cap was about to fall over her black hair. She widened her eyes and said with a silly tone, "How do you know everything? Could it be that the military academy also taught clinical medicine? From what I can see, you are qualified to be an attending physician in our hospital." Shi Qinghai was used to the little girl looking at him with admiration and shock. He leaned against the headboard and said with a smile, "You're exaggerating, aren't you? I've told you many times, I don't know how to give birth." It was already late at night. There was a suppressed cough in the lounge. He wiped off the soybean-sized beads of sweat on his forehead and fell asleep with the help of the nurse. After being woken up by Zhang Xiaoming's phone call, Su Lo couldn't sleep anymore. He stood by the window in his pajamas with his hands on his hips. He looked at the rising sun in the Westwood Sunset State. His thick eyebrows were furrowed. He was so worried that it didn't seem like him at all. Suppressing the strong uneasiness in his heart, he held his back and waited like a rock for 40 minutes. Finally, there was a reply from the capital. Gu Shifeng reported in a video message that the Federation Investigation Bureau hadn't raised the security level since 10 in the morning yesterday. However, it was obvious that there were unusual movements in the buildings in 3 states. However, the people who appeared in the areas that weren't planned were special intelligence personnel from a military region's special forces. As for Shi Qinghai's whereabouts, Gu Shifeng didn't have a clue. Or rather, the entire Federation government didn't have an answer. This was because the departments he was monitoring also seemed to be looking for someone, trying to determine if that person was alive or dead. Because it concerned Shi Qinghai's safety, Su Lo didn't care about the rules of the military. He directly contacted the members of Team 7 who had already returned to S1 and asked them to find that guy as soon as possible. However, what was unsettling was that Gu Shifeng and Xiong Linquan couldn't find any clues. Naturally, they couldn't help Shi Qinghai in any way. What was even more frightening was that Gu Shifeng had already confirmed that the party that attacked Shi Qinghai wasn't the Federation Investigation Bureau, but the Special Forces of the Federal Military. This Special Forces was very similar to Team 7. They were best at special missions such as assassination and sniping, so Su Lo was very worried about that guy's safety. He hugged his head and sat back on the sofa. The blazing autumn sun shone in through the window, drawing a dark shadow on Su Li's half-naked upper body. He asked in a low voice, "You still haven't found him?" After asking, the Federal Central Computer immediately showed a line of white light symbols in his left eye. "I can't find him." Su Lo sat up straight. His eyes were fixed on the still-burning 37 brand cigarette on the ashtray that he had forgotten to smoke. He asked in a slightly hoarse voice, "How can you not find him?" "I just can't find him. Citizen Shi Qinghai's chip signal has been interrupted. I can't locate him." The corners of Su Li's eyes twitched a few times. He swallowed his saliva and asked with difficulty, "Is he dead?" The Federal Central Computer paused for a relatively long time before replying, "I don't think so. It's just that I can't locate him. In the past tens of thousands of years, this kind of situation isn't uncommon. It's usually due to the shielding of heavy metal or layers, or the interference of electromagnetic storms in signal relay stations. But it's been almost an hour. It's not common to be unable to locate him for such a long time." Su Lo lay on the sofa. There was no expression in his eyes. He said, "Back then, when you wanted Uncle, he used a chip to replace his chip. That's why you couldn't track him. What's the point of being unable to locate him for such a long time?" Anomalies 1 to 71. A miniature signal jammer was developed. To be more precise, it's a curtain wave disguise device. This device can play a certain role. You're saying that Shi Qinghai isn't dead yet, but activated that device? Yes. Su Lo was more familiar with the device that glowed with a faint blue light than anyone else. However, he had never imagined that Shi Qinghai would also have one. He frowned and fell into a long silence. Suddenly, he said, "If the staff of the Bureau of Proclamation performs manual positioning, will they determine that Shi Qinghai is dead?" No, because I'll provide technical support and point out the illogical doubts of the sudden disappearance of the triple Y overlap. If you keep silent, will the Bureau of Proclamation think that he's dead? Yes. If you need me to keep silent, I need authorization. I authorize you to keep silent. Under the autumn sun, Sulo rubbed the painful spot between his eyebrows and issued authorization to the Federal Central Computer. Thus, in the distant spring breeze of S1, the Bureau of Proclamation confirmed Shi Qinghai's death to various key departments of the Federation. In the inpatient building of the Army General Hospital, the female nurses' lounge wasn't big. There was a small window on the south side facing the grass and green trees downstairs, exuding fresh spring air. His jacket was neatly folded at the head of the bed. A fully loaded pistol was on the left side of the pillow. Below the pillow on the right side was the magical gadget that could emit a blue light and block the radiance of Xianmen. After Shi Qinghai withdrew his gaze from the window, it naturally fell on this gadget. Years ago, in the dishwashing room behind the Lufeng Slope Clubhouse, the legendary intelligence leader who betrayed the Chow family and joined the revolution told the truth that he was dying of cancer while smoking a cigarette. At the same time, he left the most important legacy of his life to two people. He gave the 4 departments of Green Dragon Mountain to Zhang Xiaomei and gave the faint blue light to Shi Qinghai. The door was pushed open. Huang Li, who was panting, came in with an umbrella and a lunchbox. Probably because she walked too fast, the young nurse's face was red like an apple. She explained while wiping the tableware, "The second cafeteria is cooking stewed pork ribs with wax melon today. I heard that it's very delicious. I couldn't taste the synthetic flavor at all, so I went to the surgery building to get it. That's why I'm late." Shi Qinghai looked at the kind and cute young nurse with a smile. He didn't say anything. He had been hiding in this small nurse's lounge for 2 days. It was obvious that the young nurse didn't have many friends in the hospital. It seemed that she didn't have any family in the special administrative region of the capital, so she had a lot of time to take care of him. Huang Li used a metal spoon to carefully press the rice into the pork rib soup. She added some olives, stirred the soup evenly and brought it to Shi Qinghai. She glanced at the infusion tube on his left hand and smiled. "Do you want me to feed you? You can do it yourself." Shi Qinghai retracted his knee and put the lunchbox on top of it. He ate slowly, occasionally coughing in a low voice. Huang Li quietly looked at the handsome face of this mysterious military officer. She didn't know why, but she felt that her cheeks were a little hot. She subconsciously put her cold hands on her cheeks and said in a low voice, "For the past 2 days, the people in the cafeteria have been laughing at me for eating too much. Someone actually guessed that I'm pregnant. It's all your fault." Shi Qinghai raised his head and looked at her innocently until her face turned from a red apple to a morning sun. "No, that's not what I meant," Huang Li hurriedly explained while wringing her fingers. She didn't dare to look into his eyes. "Do you have a boyfriend?" Shi Qinghai suddenly asked. "No." Huang Li probably thought of something in the past. Her thin eyebrows furrowed, as if she was hiding some deep sadness. "It seems that there are a lot of blind men." Shi Qinghai smiled. He was still charming, but his lips were a little purple. It was a little difficult to smile. Chapter 719. Shi Qinghai told the freckled nurse that he was suffering from DVT, a disease called deep vein blood test that was not fatal. The most obvious sign was that the lips would turn purple, so she was fooled. She didn't know that the purple color meant that the poison was slowly but surely invading someone's circulatory system. Purple was a very strange color. Scientists had already found out that the color of food that was the most unacceptable to human beings was purple. However, experts on gender had also found out that the most acceptable color for a man's lipstick was purple. This meant that women were very willing to taste the purple lipstick on a man's lips, but they were not willing to eat purple food. What was the difference? Was it because the purple color on a man's lips represented flirtatiousness and beauty that transcended gender? Excellent and proud men, especially those who dared to wear purple lipstick, usually didn't care about the things that most people cared about. They cared more about how they looked when they were alive, and they chose to show off in an arrogant way. Just like Shi Qinghai today, his handsome face became more and more charming because of his weight loss. His eyes were as deep as the stars when contrasted with his purple lips. In the middle of the night in the hospital room, listening to the sound of the dialysis machine and the centrifugal pump, he held a cigarette in his mouth and looked at the two moons outside the window with disdain in his eyes. He cursed with arrogance, "Die. Die. Die." Although telling people to die was a very cool way to express their feelings, life and death were still the most difficult problems in the world. It was very difficult for people to face death without fear. It was not difficult to sacrifice for justice. No matter how stupid an old man was, when he was young, he could scream and throw his head away. However, it was very difficult to face death calmly. Only the most determined believers or revolutionaries could do it. Therefore, when Chao Chiu Dao died, he was very calm. He had calmly arranged his funeral in the dirty water bubbles of the dishwashing basin a long time ago. Then he died quietly, and only a few people knew where his grave was. Although Shi Qinghai was unorganized, undisciplined, and heartless to the opposite sex, which made him seem like a bastard, his revolutionary will was unquestionable. Especially this kind of will was a conscious will that he had never wavered after many years of careful and calm consideration. He would try everything to survive. He would never surrender to life in advance. Only when he was sure that he couldn't survive, then he would consider how to die and how to make his death worthwhile. During this process, he was very calm, really calm, so he was very elegant. A personal computer with a small screen with a pink bear pendant, whether in terms of appearance or performance, could not be used as a workbench for an excellent agent. Shi Qinghai didn't have any objections. He held Huang Li's laptop and watched the latest episode of The Biggest Party in Politics with great interest. Then, he endured the slow data flow and waited for the commercial satellite map to open. He carefully marked the operation details on the electronic map with a resolution of about half a meter. He drew up a plan very seriously, just like the infusion equipment and dialysis equipment in this small room were performing the protein decompression procedure very seriously. This treatment would take at least 3 days. Early in the morning, a beautiful ray of light shone through the branches of the spring trees. It then blissfully penetrated the small window and fell on Shi Qinghai's face, waking him up from his contemplation. After a busy night, his face was a little pale, and the purple on his lips was a little deeper, which made his eyes and brows look especially charming and beautiful. Shi Qinghai took out the communication chip from his belt buckle and skillfully inserted it into the clumsy Shang Xianli phone that he bought with 180 yuan. He dialed a private number. He rarely called this number, so even Su Le didn't know it. "Hello, this is the VIP department of the Sanlin United Bank. Dear VIP annual membership, it is a great honor to receive your call. Because your number is not registered, please report your card number and 18-digit spiral password." A female staff member's gentle voice came from the other end of the phone. Shi Qinghai reported his card number and password. After the account was approved, he continued, "Inform the legal department to come online. I need a lawyer to be an online witness." "Okay, please wait a moment." After about a minute, the voice on the other end of the phone said that everything was ready. Shi Qinghai took out a cigarette from the bedside and lit it. He squinted his eyes and said, "What's the status of the assets under the account now?" "Mr. Gong, according to the investment plan you made 7 years ago, the funds in the confidential account were divided into 3 parts. They were used to buy the S2 Huanshan for Prefecture's peace and reconstruction bonds, the shares of the Shell Motor Company's military mecha branch, and the shares of the Federation's crystal mining consortium. The lawyer and financial analyst on the other end of the phone had seen many strange requests, but when they saw the investment record of the confidential account for 7 years, their voice couldn't help but tremble. During the 7 years, many major events happened in the Federation. The Green Dragon Mountain anti-government army and the Federation government reconciled, the Shell Motor Company successfully developed the MX Mecha, and the Federal forces successfully entered the Empire's hinterland and occupied the X3 galaxy, which was rich in crystal mines. The problem was that 7 years ago, the anti-government army and the government army were in a bloody battle. The Shell Motor Company Engineering Department's new mecha plan was on the shelf. Especially the Crystal Mining Consortium, because of the lack of crystal mines in the Federation, it was almost unable to support the salaries of 6 million employees and was on the verge of bankruptcy. Who could have predicted the occurrence of these 3 major events 7 years ago and bought the bonds and stocks of the stakeholders without hesitation? This was no longer a problem of investment vision, but more like a miraculous prediction of fate. The owner of this secret account magically grasped the general trend of the political and economic situation in the Federation, and obtained an incredible return on investment. Based on the calculation of the account data, this account was without a doubt the strongest investor in the Federation in the past 7 years. So much so that the financial analyst of the Sanlin United Bank on the other end of the phone was shocked and couldn't help but break the professional rules and sincerely invite him to the headquarters of the Sanlin United Bank for a chat. He expressed his strong desire to invite him to the headquarters of the Sanlin United Bank. On the other end of the phone, Shi Qinghai didn't have any emotional changes. He knew that he could become the best fund manager, the best doctor, or the best lawyer in the Federation. But what was the point? Those things couldn't change anything. Liquidate all the assets, he said to the phone. Then use all of them to buy the benchmark stocks of your bank, and help me make a trust plan. Yes, Mr. Gong. The lawyer on the other end of the phone asked, who is the beneficiary of the trust plan? His name is Zhou Liuhua, and his citizen number is... Shi Qinghai lit another cigarette and slowly reported the number. Then, according to the requirements of the bank, he went through the troublesome data verification. After hanging up the phone, Shi Qinghai began to stare blankly. The liquid medicine slowly and silently dripped into his veins, and the light of dawn slowly and silently moistened his purple lips. He was recalling his life, and increasingly felt that he owed a lot of people and women. So he picked up the phone and began to dial phone numbers one by one. The owners of these phone numbers were scattered all over the Federation, and there was even one who was far away in the Sunset State in the West Woods. Without exception, they were all women with different styles, and they had all had a one-night stand with him. The amazing thing was that after so many years, he had never forgotten these phone numbers. His memory was really amazing. On the other end of the phone, some were busy, some were empty, and some were forcefully hung up when Shi Qinghai introduced himself and gently talked about a snowy night in a hotel. He tried to help the woman recall the beautiful memories, as if the woman was running away from a demon in a panic. However, most of the women on the other end of the phone were pleasantly surprised by Shi Qinghai's call. The young girls screamed, and the mature women asked and they would meet again in a low and seductive voice. They could not hide their excitement, and 2 women even fainted in their bedrooms due to excitement. Shi Qinghai didn't call Zhou Yu, but the last call of this round was to the beautiful girl who had accompanied him to explore the beautiful beaches of the island. Meow, this is Gongzi Shi. You, are you okay now? The other end of the phone was silent for a long time, and then the girl's hesitant voice sounded. You, are you Lao Gong? Mr. Shi, who had a wicked sense of shame, held the phone tightly. Some time ago, he had told Su Le that he had been accompanied by so many women in his life, but now that he thought about it carefully, he couldn't forget her on the beach in Nank. Why was that? It was probably because at that time, he thought that he could really relax and even live a normal life. And that beach was really too beautiful. The so-called right person was the one he met at the right place at the right time. It's me. Shi Qinghai gently rubbed his lips with the pad of his index finger, but he couldn't make the purple color fade. I haven't seen you in a long time, so I'm calling to ask how you're doing. Are you still a teacher? The girl on the other end of the phone was silent for a moment, and then answered in a low voice like a well-behaved kitten, yes, yes. I'm still a teacher at Wangdu No. 17 Primary School. How about you? Are you okay? What are you doing now? You're in Wangdu. Shi Qinghai's brows furrowed slightly. Thinking about that place that was not far away, he subconsciously looked out the window. He didn't ask this girl called Meow Meow why she still kept her old phone number after so long, because he was afraid of hearing an overly sentimental answer. I'm fine. I'm just calling to see how you're doing, and then, thank you for bringing me that beautiful time in my life. Goodbye. After saying this, which he repeated seriously to every girl, Shi Qinghai hung up the phone without hesitation. His light purple lips were tightly pressed together. Chapter 720. Huang Li finished her night shift, but she didn't go back to her cold home. Instead, she went back to her resting room as usual. Although there was one more man in the room, it was much warmer. The nurse was chatting with Shi Qinghai. She wrinkled her cute nose to express her strong dissatisfaction with the smoke, but she didn't stop the needle in her hand. She felt that this kind of life was very stressful and exciting, but she didn't want to stop. Is there anything you want to do but don't dare to do? Shi Qinghai was lying on his back at the head of the bed with a cigarette in his mouth. He squinted his eyes and looked at the pretty nurse like a pervert. The problem was that his lips were too purple, and his eyebrows were too straight, so the pervert became a charming existence in some kind of religious fresco. Why are you so bad? Huang Li shyly buried her head and didn't dare to look at his eyes. She only dared to stare at the needle in the knitted sweater. You're still an officer of the Federation. Shi Qinghai was choked and coughed again and again. He quickly explained, I'm serious. Huang Li frowned and looked up. Her freckles were shining in the morning sun. She suddenly said seriously, I was dumped by my boyfriend. Can you help me vent my anger? Okay. Shi Qinghai's answer was very simple and direct. Aren't you going to ask about the situation? Huang Li opened her eyes wide in surprise and asked while covering her mouth. Please, I'm a spy. I don't have time to study these things. I promise you I'll do it. Shi Qinghai waved the cigarette in his hand. You don't look like a member of the Special Forces. Huang Li put down the sweater angrily and made a cup of high-concentration protein powder for him. After a moment of silence, she explained, my boyfriend found a daughter of a big family. I know this kind of thing is normal. I don't like him now, but I don't want him to be too complacent, so I want to find a very good man to anger him. I like your character, although it's a bit old-fashioned and there's nothing new. Shi Qinghai gave her a thumbs up and said, and if you want to find a good man to anger other men, I'm definitely the best choice in the entire Federation. Virtue. Huang Li ridiculed, hurry up and get your illness treated. Otherwise, when people see your purple lipstick, they will think that you're from the special industry. Shi Qinghai smiled, but he wasn't angry. He asked, what's your boyfriend's name? Wu Jing. Huang Li lowered her head slightly and said, he's the most promising doctor in the pathology department. In the narrow lounge, there was an even narrower washroom. Huang Li stared at herself in the mirror in a daze. She did not understand why she trusted that mysterious Federation officer so much and why she would tell him all the painful stories of her past. All of a sudden, she felt a little regretful. Looking at her cheeks that alternated between red and pale in the mirror, she bit her lower lip and lowered her head. This guy looks like a bad guy, but he's really good looking. I hope he won't misunderstand. Why didn't you say you were poisoned? I've already checked. The military drugs you want me to steal are used to treat neurotoxins. The nurse looked at Shih nervously and said in a trembling voice, even the doctors don't know how to use these drugs. In the end, we only found the articles in the research system of Area 1. The problem is that this treatment method is still in the experimental stage. Are you going to experiment with your own body? What else can I do? Shih did not expect that this silly and cute nurse with freckles would discover the problem in his body through drugs. He smiled gently and said, "You were kind enough to hide me here and sleep beside my feet at night. Although I didn't say it out loud, I'm really grateful. I don't want to cause too much trouble for you. There's no difference between looking for a doctor and treating myself. Although I don't know what kind of poison you were poisoned with, it seems that dialysis and blood filtration can't solve the problem. We should go find a doctor and do a clinical blood transfusion. There might be a chance." Huang Li stared at him nervously. Her eyes were wet, as if she was about to cry. "It's not that serious. My body is much better now." Shih laughed and patted the nurse's shoulder to comfort her. However, he knew that a clinical blood transfusion was useless. The poison used by the Federation's special forces was too powerful. Shih believed that this dark force had never used such expensive and rare drugs before. His reaction and treatment methods were timely and accurate, but he still could not stop the invasion of the poison. "You haven't gotten better. I've been looking at you every day. How can I not know?" Huang Li said nervously. Yes, Shih body had not gotten better. If it wasn't for the fact that he had continuously ingested tiny amounts of poison for 3 years during his special agent training to improve his immune system, he might have already fainted on the hospital bed. There's no hope of survival unless you do a bone marrow transplant after a blood transfusion. Looking at the nurse who was about to cry, Shih did not understand why the girl trusted him so much. After a moment of silence, he decided to tell the truth. He smiled and said, "But I don't want to do it. At least, I don't want to do it now." "Why?" Huang Li wiped away the tears on her face and asked in confusion with her eyes wide open. "There's a big possibility that you'll be paralyzed." Shih wrinkled his nose and stretched out 2 fingers to show the distance. "It's very big. So it's not interesting. It's interesting to be alive." The nurse clenched her small fists and retorted. "If you could be reincarnated in the next life, but could only be an animal, would you rather be an eagle than a tortoise?" Shih lowered his head and smoked his cigarette. His light purple lips were very eye-catching. "So for life, living freely is always more important than dying slowly." The nurse opened her slightly red eyes and said stubbornly, "Why not be a rabbit?" Shih smiled and lowered his head to play with the carbon filter between his fingers. He said, "I've drunk the best wine, driven the fastest car, flown a plane or spaceship, played with the most powerful gun, and slept with the most beautiful woman. I have no regrets in this life." Why do these words sound so familiar? Because these are the common lines of the playboy in Schiller's early scripts. Slept with the most beautiful woman. Huang Li laughed at him clumsily and tried to persuade him. "Playboy, don't always try to brag about your achievements. You haven't slept with Jian Shuier." Shih raised his charming face and laughed happily. "Of course I can't bully my friend's wife. But even Jian Shuier's man has to admit that my woman is not inferior to his woman. But, you should still do the surgery." The nurse was speechless and said with a red face. Shih looked at her and gently lifted her chin. His fingertips gently rubbed the soft flesh under her chin and said in a low voice, "I'm not trying to be pretentious. Death is not scary. The scariest thing is to die in bed and in your sleep. Isn't this the happiest way to leave the world? When we're born, we don't know how we came to this world. We don't have the authority to approve or review. We don't even have any memory." Shi Qinghai said, "In this life, there are only two words, life and death. You can't remember when you were born. If you don't even know how you died, then your life is too muddled. How can there be any happiness in it? I've always wanted to know or control how I died. If I had enough time, of course I would design my death beautifully. If I had more time, I even wanted to arrange a funeral in advance and let all my friends and family come to give their tearful speeches while I sit in the coffin and watch the drama with a smile." Shi Qinghai's eyes were very calm because he was speaking the truth. "You have a mental illness, you need to be treated." The nurse stared at him in a daze. She bit her lower lip and said stubbornly, "So you can't leave." The electronic pump made a soft beeping sound. The protein decompression process was completed. Shi Qinghai looked at the empty medicine bottle and suddenly smiled. He pulled out the needle from the back of his hand, stood on the ground and put on his clothes. He then put the heavy pistol behind his waist. He gently hugged the nurse to express his sincere gratitude. Shi Qinghai's light purple lips moved slightly. He whispered in her ear, "I can't stay here forever. If I keep asking you to steal medicine for me, it will be exposed. I promise you, after this mission, I'll come back immediately for the operation." "You're lying to me." Huang Li tightly pursed her lips and said, "I'm not lying to you. I have to do missions. Otherwise, how can I earn the allowance, treat the patients and support so many women?" Shi Qinghai smiled and patted her cheek. He walked out of the room without stopping. Huang Li stared at the slightly swaying door in a daze. Her fingertips were a little numb and painful. In fact, maybe she had already guessed that this man was lying, but she didn't know why she didn't want to expose him. Women were all captives of romanticism. But for this kind little nurse with cute freckles, that man and this encounter had nothing to do with romanticism. She just looked at the beautiful man with purple lipstick and felt happy. Her heart beat faster. This was not romance, this was love. For the little nurse, these few short days were probably the most unforgettable time in her life. If she wanted to tell her granddaughter the story of the past when she was old, she would definitely not leave out this part. "I'll support you." She suddenly rushed out of the room and shouted loudly towards the end of the corridor. Perhaps because she shouted too loudly, there was even a trace of crying in her voice. No one appeared at the end of the corridor. Only the startled patients and nurses curiously poked their heads out. They looked at the girl who was squatting on the floor and crying bitterly. They didn't know what had happened. Shi Qinghai, who left the Army General Hospital from the back door, didn't know what had happened upstairs. He smiled and stole a car, then entered the capital special district. He took the necessary tools from a place that only he knew. Then, he walked into an old wig shop in a remote area and bought a reddish-brown wig. He looked in the mirror and tried to put it on his head. He felt that the reddish-brown wig and light purple lips were very ugly. He couldn't help but shake his head. Chapter 721. Because of the military god's funeral, many of the Federation government's affairs had to be delayed. Especially some activities that contradicted the solemn atmosphere of the funeral, such as awards, celebrations, and the like, were delayed for a longer time. The first batch of troops to attack the Empire had already rotated for more than a month. Because of this reason, the awards ceremony was only held today. The soldiers on the front line were brave and had obtained outstanding military achievements. Because of this, the number of people who were awarded was particularly large. The entire award ceremony was held over 2 days. Yesterday, Mr. President Pobre had already held a ceremony for the 17th Division of the 1st Military Region. Today, the main character of the ceremony was the 3rd Military Region represented by the Iron 7th Division. And the most important person present today was Vice President Byron. It had to be admitted that Du Shaoqing and his Iron 7th Division had made the biggest contribution in this attack on the Empire. Therefore, even if Mr. President couldn't personally come because of important matters, the entire award ceremony felt a little higher than yesterday. At the corner of the Charter Square, the Parliament Hill had already gathered countless dignitaries. And in addition to the reporters entering the hall, the Federation's major TV stations arranged even more cameras under the long stone steps. They were responsible for transmitting the heroic image of the Iron 7th Division and the other troops to every family's TV screen. Shimin-Jin knew that he would be awarded the second-class Purple Letter Medal today. This was a very rare honor. But this was not the main point he was concerned about. He was worried about his relationship with his teacher. It seemed that he could never return to the past. Although he was still incomparably loyal to his teacher, but it was very clear that after discovering that he directly accepted the mission, his teacher's trust in him was no longer the same as before. Standing in front of the urinal, Shimin-Jin expressionlessly lowered his head to look at the reflection of his figure on the white porcelain. He couldn't help but frown. Many years ago, he knew that the price of the superfine white porcelain urinal in the washroom of the Parliament Hill was exactly the same as the relief money received by the unemployed miners of the Donglin mine. At that time, the young people caused a ruckus on the internet for a long time, but in the end, it didn't arouse any response. If he didn't have the opportunity to come to the washroom of the Parliament Hill today, Shimin-Jin himself might have already forgotten about this matter. Thinking about the naive and impulsive hot-bloodedness of those years, and associating it with today's calmness and prospects, he faintly smiled. He felt that the heat between his legs was very comfortable. At this moment, a sharp whistle came from behind him. Someone walked in. The whistling sound was not loud, but it was particularly sharp. The tune was lively and jumping without stop. Moreover, it was somewhat familiar. Shimin-Jin wrinkled her eyes and nose at the same time. She wanted to distinguish what tune this was. It was obviously familiar, but she didn't remember such a lively tune. Her teacher also shouldn't have played it before. The person behind Shimin-Jin stepped on the wet floor and walked back and forth. He heavily put down the bucket and mop, then closed the door and started whistling again. After that, he walked towards Shimin-Jin. As a matter of fact, when the whistle sounded for the first time, the muscles of Shimin-Jin's genitals had already begun to tighten vigilantly. Some kind of indescribable extreme sense of danger made him quickly stop the action of excreting and prepare to welcome the attack. That person didn't launch an attack. Instead, he stood silently behind him. Along with 2 clear paw-paw sounds, 2 long cleaning gloves were thrown beside Shimin-Jin's feet. Water splashed on the shiny military boots of this officer, immediately destroying the kind of solemn ceremony beauty. Hearing the sharp whistle sound gradually becoming hoarse, Shimin-Jin's pupils shrunk. Staring at his own figure and that fuzzy shadow behind him, he took a deep breath and tightly pursed his lips. Then with a schwa sound, he pulled up the zipper of his military pants, then silently turned around. Wearing brand new military uniform, the senior officer of Iron 7th Division, Colonel Shimin-Jin, had his hands behind his back. With indifferent expression, he looked at that cleaning worker wearing hat in front of him. Looking at the clear and cold eyes of this person, he asked, "Shi Qinghai?" The cleaning worker slowly took off his mask, raised his light purple lips, and asked with a smile, "Colonel Shimin-Jin? You should be dead." After being silent for a moment, Shimin-Jin suddenly said. Shi Qinghai put on that big white cotton mask again, and said from under the mask, "My luck is good." Shimin Jin's sharp eyes fell on his mask, and said, "We have studied you, you are overconfident, so you are not too difficult to deal with. Of course there is a reason to be confident." Shi Qinghai used his slightly wet left hand to rub his nose, and said, "That is why I can stand in front of you now. Is the wine delicious? I rarely drink such expensive wine, but I heard you like it, so I specially prepared some for you." Shimin Jin suddenly laughed, and calmly said, "You should know that the seasonings inside the wine are much more expensive than those 10 bottles of wine added together. The taste is not bad, but it's a pity. I thought you were also a wine lover, so at that time I also praised your taste." Shi Qinghai said, "Now that I think about it, I made a mistake. A real wine lover, it is impossible to live as trivial and cowardly as you." Shimin Jin put his hands behind his back, looked at him sympathetically, and said, "Since you have already drunk wine, then you will die sooner or later, unless you immediately go for a bone marrow transplant, but then you may become a vegetable. As the most outstanding student of the Green Dragon Mountain Hospital, you should be very clear about the consequences. Since that is the case, I suggest you go to the hospital immediately, instead of standing here and chatting with me. Verbal humiliation has no meaning to people like us." "You are wrong. I am not chatting with you, I am humiliating you, intimidating you, and making you feel fear, because I like to do such things." Shi Qinghai lightly held the pistol, smiled, and aimed at Shimin Jin's forehead, and said, "And you have to know that we are never the same kind of people, especially now. I have a gun in my hand, and you don't, so you can only accept my humiliation." Relying on the 3 layers of chip scanning and the whole body scanning, no one had ever been able to bring a weapon into the Parliament Mountain Hall, but today, Shi Qinghai clearly broke this rule, because sometimes he could emit a blue light because of his purple lips. Shimin Jin, who was being aimed at by the black muzzle, couldn't help but slightly twitch his eyebrows, frowned and said in a low voice, "You can pull the trigger directly." "Why would I do that?" Shi Qinghai suddenly frowned and asked. "For the Federation, for fairness, you people don't know how great of a cause we are engaged in." Shimin Jin slightly raised his head, and his tilted chin revealed a very strong pride and faint mockery. "How can you people stop the tide of history?" Shi Qinghai shrugged. "I investigated the case of the Linhai State Gymnasium for 5 years, and now I've finally caught you. You have to admit this fact." "What am I?" Shimin Jin suddenly laughed nervously, and looked at the big mask on Shi Qinghai's face as if he was looking at something ridiculous, and asked, "Do you and Su Lu know who your enemy is? Do you know who we are?" Shi Qinghai raised the pistol, aimed at his forehead, and calmly asked, "Yes, I really want to know who the councilman behind you is. At first, I thought it was Byron, but I found that I miscalculated the timeline by 2 months, so the councilman you serve is someone else. Also, I want to know how deeply involved Du Shaoqing is in this matter." Shimin Jin seemed to be able to guess that the bullet would enter his brain in the next moment, and his breathing became rapid. After a while, he frowned and said coldly, "Shoot, maybe in the future, I can convince you why our path is right, why we have to make a move on those families, this federation." Without waiting for him to finish his impassioned speech, a muffled crisp sound echoed in the bathroom. The sound of a pistol with a silencer was not loud, but the crisp sound of a spring firing was so pleasing to the ear. Shimin Jin covered his bleeding abdomen, staggered against the wall, and looked at the light smoke coming out of the barrel in Shi Qinghai's hand in disbelief. It seemed that he did not expect the other party to shoot so suddenly, and the electronic military knife that he held tightly behind his back also fell to the ground miserably. "You feel that you are going to die, so you want to make a speech to strengthen your fear of death? Or are you trying to convince me with these words?" Shi Qinghai looked down at Shimin Jin as if he was looking at a clown. He used the barrel of the gun to rub the skin under the mask that was itching because of the nosebleed, and said mockingly, "Can't you see that I am just teasing you? Really fucking, I hate politics classes the most. Shimin-jin's face was pale, and he covered his bleeding abdomen. He was in so much pain that beads of sweat were dripping from his forehead. He weakly slid down from the wall and sat in the fine porcelain urinal. He spread his legs weakly, breathed rapidly, and said with a sad smile, "How can you people understand? I don't need to understand your greatness, glory, and rightness." Shi Qinghai expressionlessly dealt with the silencer. He did not even look at him, and said, "Everyone has their own greatness, glory, and rightness. For me, what you did was murder, shameless and despicable." He raised his right foot and stepped on Shimin-jin's lower abdomen. He pressed the wound with his other hand, took out a small ball made of metal wire from his backpack, and began to pull it out continuously. Shimin-jin was in so much pain that his face turned pale. He asked, "What do you want to do?" In the politics class of Green Dragon Mountain, there was a saying that not only must justice be done, in order to make people believe it, it must also be seen by people. Shi Qinghai lowered his head and put the metal wire through the officer's throat. He then wrapped it around the officer's back and tied a few very complicated knots. He also installed a few compound pulleys. He then explained, "The signature is Beachcammer." Later, I checked again and again, but I couldn't find out who this Beachcammer was, so I suspect that this is a famous saying forged by the 4 departments of Green Dragon Mountain. But I am going to do this today. After tying the end of the extremely tough metal wire to the metal switch of the urinal, Shi Qinghai checked it with satisfaction. After that, he turned his head and looked at Shimin-jin, who was breathing more and more rapidly, and said, "This matter is related to justice, because this matter is related to the deceased in Linhai Prefecture's gymnasium, the deceased in the concert, as well as my cute fat teacher, these innocent people." Shimin-jin smiled sadly and said, "Jian Shui'er's concert has nothing to do with me." "Oh, sorry, I have wronged you." Shi Qinghai apologized slightly exaggeratedly, and then said in a deep voice, "Isn't this what you are best at? I want your punishment to be seen by people, and I have to deal with a lot of things later, such as that teacher of yours, that mister who is about as fat as my teacher, so you can't die too quickly, otherwise the people in the Bureau of Proclamation will react." Shi Qinghai continued his work of twisting the metal wire. Sweat gradually seeped out of his back. He gasped for breath and said, "Ralph Snow Mountain knot, isn't it very professional?" Shimin-jin was in so much pain that he couldn't speak, but he still nodded valiantly. Shi Qinghai picked up the military knife from the wet ground, and made 2 cuts on Shimin-jin's abdomen, then slowly stabbed it in. The friction between the sharp metal and the tight muscles made a strange sound, and blood slowly seeped out from the edge of the knife. That gun pierced through the small intestine and destroyed your columnar nerve bundle. This stab just happened to enter the spleen, 0.3 centimeters. According to the speed of bleeding, you will immediately lose consciousness, and then after half an hour, you will die, and then the Bureau of Proclamation will receive the message that your chip is no longer working. Shi Qinghai frowned and slowly pulled out the military knife, and gave the last technical explanation to Shimin-jin, who was about to faint from the pain. "Don't you think I am very professional?" After throwing the military knife into the side compartment, Shi Qinghai took off the mask, and wiped the blood clot that was flowing out of his nose. He gasped for breath, and then Shimin-jin, who was leaning against the urinal, lit a cigarette, and took 2 deep breaths. There is another important reason for this matter, and it has nothing to do with justice. He looked at the row of porcelain urinals opposite the room, and said with the cigarette in his mouth, "You are a very professional guy, and I am also a professional. Since we have been doing this for so many years, in the end, we have to be very professional and fight for victory and defeat. As a man, isn't this what we fight for our whole life?" Shi Qinghai took out the cigarette in his mouth, and stuffed it into Shimin-jin's mouth, and then patted his face. Shimin-jin's dry lips quickly trembled, and greedily took 2 deep breaths. Actually, if you really believe in those things that you insist on, just before you die, you don't need to say it to convince yourself. Shi Qinghai took out that reddish-brown wig from his clothes, and with some difficulty put it on Shimin Jin's head, then took out his mobile phone and aimed it at him, and seriously said, "Smile." The cigarette fell on the clothes, and then fell into the pool of blood, and was instantly extinguished. Shimin Jin finally fainted, and was tied up by the metal wire. The 2 wounds on his abdomen were slowly bleeding, and his dry lips were spitting out blood bubbles. He was paralyzed and humiliated as he sat on the urinal, sitting on his own urine. This is what I promised that guy in the past. Shi Qinghai looked at the unconscious enemy, and somewhat regretfully shrugged his shoulders. After thinking for a while, he squatted next to the urinal, and put his face next to Shimin Jin's face. He raised his cheap mobile phone high and took a selfie, and then sent a text message to Sulu, who was far away in the West Woods. In the photo, Shimin Jin's lips were white, and he was spitting out blood bubbles in his unconscious state. Coupled with the poor quality reddish-brown wig, he looked like an evil clown. Mr. Shi's face next to him was smiling very happily. Although he had a pair of light purple lips, he was so beautiful, but there was a kind of cruel and innocent beauty. Chapter 722. Shi Qinghai took off his janitor's uniform, took out a dark green military windbreaker from his backpack, and put it on. Then, he began to attach a gun to the standard buckle on his belt. All kinds of guns were neatly arranged inside the windbreaker, glowing faintly, like a series of sharp knives prepared by a master chef. Whistling faintly, he walked to the sink and washed his face. After rinsing off all the sweat and blood with cold water, he began to seriously apply lipstick in front of the mirror. This time, it was a real lipstick. It was to cover up the purple color of his fake lips. Looking at the handsome and charming man in the mirror, but because of his pale face, he looked extremely haggard and pitiful. Mr. Shi raised his eyebrows in annoyance, squinted his eyes, and slapped his cheeks, indulging in the violent and crisp sound of the slapping to make his skin rosy. He took out a comb and meticulously combed his hair until it was smooth and bright. After confirming that even a fly with a cane wouldn't be able to stand on it, he nodded in satisfaction. He took out a pair of glasses with thick lenses from the pocket of his windbreaker and put them on the bridge of his nose. Then, he gently rubbed the button on the leg of the glasses with the pad of his finger, and began to wirelessly connect to the signal transmission point outside the building on Parliament Hill. After finishing his preparations, Shi Qinghai walked out of the bathroom, locked the wooden door with a tool, and hung a sign saying, "Cleaning in progress," on it. Then, a light and cute whistle sounded from his lips again. In the corridor covered with a plush carpet, a noblewoman brushed past him. Suddenly, she turned around and looked at him, a glimmer of light flashing in her eyes. At this time, Shi Qinghai was wearing the dark green military windbreaker, and looked extremely handsome. The eye-catching gold one on the shoulder of the military windbreaker added a touch of valiance that intoxicated the noblewoman. What song were you humming just now?" the noblewoman asked with a smile. Shi Qinghai stopped in his tracks and answered with a smile, "Madam, it was 27 glasses of wine." "A very old and beautiful song," the noblewoman said reservedly. "Are you an officer here to participate in the award ceremony?" "I know there will be a dinner after the ceremony, but I don't know if you have any plans after the dinner." This noble lady was very charming, but unfortunately, Shi Qinghai did not have the time. He bowed slightly and politely expressed his sincere apology. "Sorry, I have some important work to do after the award ceremony." Shi Qinghai indeed had a very important job to do, especially after sneaking into the Special Task Force's security list and confirming that Vice President Byron would not be attending the dinner after the ceremony today. Instead, he would be leaving right away, so he was forced to work earlier. In order to commend the heroic deeds of the frontline soldiers, Parliament Hill passed a temporary proposal to generously provide a magnificent Parliament Hall to the Department of National Defense for the purpose of holding an award ceremony. Shi Qinghai leaned against the inconspicuous wooden door on the side. Holding a glass of light-colored sparkling apple wine, he calmly observed the interior of the tall and magnificent Parliament building. After the award ceremony, there would be a grand dinner. The organizers had prepared a huge wine tower, which happened to be behind the door behind Shi Qinghai. The light blue sparkling wine had a pleasant color to it, and it looked like the perfect combination of magnificence and serenity in the mountains. Shi Qinghai finished a glass of sparkling apple wine and drank another. When he picked up the third glass, he raised his eyebrows slightly and looked up alertly. He saw a beautiful woman in the crowd in the distance. She was wearing a Federation officer's uniform, but there was a little red flower in her cloud-like black hair. She was looking at him coldly. Zhou Yu was now the deputy director of a policy research room in the Department of National Defense. It was not strange for her to appear at an award ceremony organized by the military. In particular, Minister Zhou Yingxing was unable to attend the ceremony because she had to preside over the posture test at Transit Base No. 1. Her presence could at least relieve some of the tension. Zhou Yu did not know that Shi Qinghai had gone missing during this time, so when she saw him standing in an inconspicuous corner, wearing a well-ironed military trench coat, she only felt a little strange. Shi Qinghai raised the glass of sparkling apple wine in his hand and smiled at her. When he saw that she seemed to want to talk to him, he frowned slightly and put the glass on the table behind him. He then blended into the chaotic crowd and silently walked to the front of the Parliament Hill's rostrum. 6 professional high-definition cameras moved slowly in different positions, broadcasting the scene in the Parliament Hill to every household in the Federation. The awards ceremony officially began. The officers of the 3rd Military Region's Air and Ground Support Brigade were the first to receive the award, followed by the other heroes of the 3rd Military Region's Field Forces. It was not until the second half of the ceremony that the famous officers and soldiers of the Iron 7th Division walked up to the rostrum and received the medals and awards from the hands of the Parliament members. Even on such an occasion, the officers of the Iron 7th Division were very stingy with their smiles. Their waists were straight, their bodies were straight, their eyes were straight, and their hands were on the Magna Carta. Their expressions were firm and calm. Just like their teacher Du Shaoqing. Even more enthusiastic applause sounded in the Parliament Hall, but because the interior of the building was too spacious, the loud and enthusiastic applause could not receive the same enthusiastic response from the walls. In a very short time, the applause was annihilated and could not be heard. The architect who designed the Parliament Hill back then probably hated the constant meetings of the Federation. Every time there was a meeting, the Parliament members had to applaud enthusiastically. So, he deliberately designed the hall in such a way that it conflicted with the principles of sound. Shi Qinghai thought about these boring and extended thoughts while quietly watching the big shots of the Federation on the rostrum. What puzzled and slightly disappointed him was that Du Shaoqing did not come to the ceremony in person. The ceremony reached its final stage. The kind-looking Vice President Byron walked down the rostrum accompanied by the Special Task Force agents and the Parliament members. Everyone who was familiar with the highest command of the Iron 7th Division knew that there were only 3 officers of the Iron 7th Division who were qualified to be worn by the Vice President of the Federation in person. They were Commander Du Shaoqing and his 2 most loyal and reliable arms, Shimin Jin and Dong Fangpei. However, Commander Dong Fangpei had now been stripped of all his military positions and was coldly kicked into the NTR unit of the 17th Division by Du Shaoqing. Although there was no good news of his sacrifice for the country, he was certainly not qualified to receive the Federation's commendation. Du Shaoqing did not come at all. For this ice general, all the warm celebrations in the special district of the capital made him feel disgusted and uncomfortable. Therefore, Colonel Shimin was the only one left in the highest command of the Iron 7th Division as a representative. At this time, no one knew that he had been tied to a urinal by metal wires and was playing the role of a sad, bleeding clown. He was on his last breath and could die at any time. No one answered. Shimin did not appear. The empty building on the Parliament Hill became quiet. The officers attending the ceremony and the crowd watching the ceremony did not know what had happened. On the rostrum, the official in charge of presiding over the ceremony quickly glanced at the camera lens that was still broadcasting live. He stood behind Vice President Byron and whispered a few words. The general idea was that he wanted Vice President Byron to give a touching speech in advance to fool the awkward atmosphere. But not everything in the world could be fooled by politicians, at least not today. Clear and powerful footsteps were heard. Heavy military boots crushed the precious wooden stairs. Shi Qinghai walked up to the rostrum with a smile and slowly undid the first button of his dark green military windbreaker. Before the agents of the Special Task Force and the Parliament staff could react, he said, "I know where Colonel Shimin is." When he said this, he gently placed his left hand on the huge and thick Magna Carta. He looked at the people below the rostrum calmly. The red on his slightly pursed lips could not hide the shocking purple. A staff member walked up to him and said in a low voice, "Mr. Officer, this is the award ceremony. The Federation is broadcasting it live. Please go down first. I don't want to send security personnel." Shi Qinghai coughed softly and explained, "I am indeed not the guy who came to participate in the award ceremony. You can tell from my military uniform that I am not from the 7th Division. I am from the Special 1st Division." After the Federation's reconciliation, a large part of the anti-government forces in Green Dragon Mountain were reorganized by the government and were given a new name, which was the Special 1st Division. In the battle to destroy the Imperial Expeditionary Force in the West Woods, the Special 1st Division performed well and made great contributions. However, the Federation government seemed to have turned a blind eye to this matter. People thought they knew the purpose of this officer's visit and could not help but feel a little embarrassed. The Parliament Hall became even quieter. "Does no one want to know where Colonel Shimin is?" Shi Qinghai smiled and looked at the people below the rostrum. In the crowd, someone shouted, "Where is he? Tell us." "He is now waiting for trial in the moral court of death." Someone answered. Shi Qinghai was finally satisfied. He smiled and said, "There are other people who are about to be tried." He gently stroked the linen cover of the Magna Carta with his palm and looked back at those members who were confused. He looked at Vice President Byron, who was walking back to the rostrum under the protection of the special agents, and suddenly started to call out names. Vice President Byron, Senator Mace, Senator Paulson, General Hu Zhu. After calling out the names of 6 or 7 important people, he narrowed his eyes and glanced at the stiff people on the rostrum. He smiled and said, "Very good. Most of you are here. Then I announce, because you are involved in the Linhai State Gymnasium assassination, the Ancient Bell attack, the murder of my fat teacher, and the fact that you control the Federation government and the judicial system, according to the First Charter and the relevant amendments, I have decided to execute the citizen's arrest right on you." Shi Qinghai put his left hand on the thick Magna Carta, looked at those people and said seriously, "If you resist, I will execute you directly according to the arrest right and the militia wartime regulations." Shi Gongzi's calm voice echoed in the solemn and empty hall. Everyone looked at each other, unable to understand what was going on. Probably not many people remembered that there was a citizen's arrest right hidden in the depths of the First Charter. The first reaction of people was that this was ridiculous. This was too ridiculous. Was there something wrong with the handsome and serious officer on the rostrum? Vice President Byron, under the protection of the special agents, walked out of the Parliament with a serious expression. He did not want to be affected by this ridiculous episode. Indeed, no one resisted Shi Qinghai's arrest, because they all thought that the so-called citizen's arrest was just a lunatic's nonsense. A counselor pointed at Shi Qinghai angrily and scolded him harshly. Shi Qinghai narrowed his eyes slightly. His eardrums seemed to have lost any physiological function at this moment. He could only see that the member's mouth was constantly changing shape, and there was obviously a disgusting residue of dirty cigarette teeth that were often washed. Chapter 723. Before Shi Qinghai pulled the trigger, and even after he pulled the trigger, no one in the hall believed that the handsome officer in the dark green military trench coat, who was talking about meaningless charges and civil arrest rights that no one understood, would do anything. In the eyes of the people, Shi Qinghai was a lunatic, and the whole thing was a ridiculous joke that had no practical significance. Just like Shimin Jin's mistake, based on their absolute trust in the charter and the electronic surveillance network scanning system, no one thought that Shi Qinghai would be able to bring firearms into Parliament Hill, and even more so, no one thought that there would be many, many guns in his elegant dark green military windbreaker. Because of this reason, no one took his request seriously, except for a beautiful woman with a little red flower in her black hair. People looked at him coldly and mockingly. Even the cameraman of the TV station, who was supposed to cut off the live broadcast of the incident, didn't seem to care about the matter. The security guards of the Parliament Hill were embarrassed to think about how they allowed a lunatic veteran to sneak into the hall. The special task force agents stationed everywhere were ready to protect the vice president and several members of the parliament as they left. They didn't pay any attention to Shi Qinghai, who was on the stage like an idiot according to the charter. They might be laughing at the guards in their hearts, or they might be busy talking in a low voice with their white earphones, acting like cold and stern special agents. Until Shi Qinghai pulled the trigger, the high-speed bullet bloomed in front of the barrel like a firework, and then penetrated the body of the parliament member. It quickly took away his blood and life through countless beautiful and tragic holes. Then, almost in an instant, no one knew how he did it. The Falcon long-range precision pistol in his military trench coat appeared in his left hand, and he pulled the trigger at the vice president, who was walking out of Parliament Hill. With a muffled sound, the powerful recoil shook the sleeve of the military officer. At the end of the crowd, who had just reacted and started screaming, crying, and panicking, Vice President Byron, who was speeding up to leave, fell heavily to the ground as if he had been hit hard. The special task force agents, who were known for their professionalism, actually couldn't block the fatal bullet from behind because of a moment of panic. A moment later, the fat Vice President Byron crawled up with great difficulty. The hard ceramic bulletproof vest successfully saved his life, but there was no way to save the few broken ribs. Amidst the screams and cries, the special task force agents protected him in the middle with bloodshot eyes and quickly retreated to the entrance of Parliament Hill, not leaving Shi Qinghai any path of attack. In the narrow nurses' lounge of the Army General Hospital, there was still a single bed. The pink decor, along with the centrifugal pump and dialysis apparatus that had not been returned in time, were piled up messily beside the bed. At the very least, it proved that that person really existed and had really appeared. The pretty nurse pursed her lips sadly. Her nose was blocked, and the few cute freckles on the bridge of her nose had lost their luster. At this time, a familiar voice suddenly sounded on the TV screen. She looked up in surprise and saw a man wearing a dark green military trench coat suddenly appear at the scene of the Frontline Soldiers Award ceremony that was being broadcasted live on the news channel. "What are you talking about? How can the Vice President of the Federation be a criminal? That citizen's arrest right of yours is really funny as the cold jokes you tell in this small room. Come down, don't mess around on the stage, that's a serious place. Since you're not a member of the special forces of a military region, why are you there? Come down, old gong, don't get into trouble." Wu Li stared at the TV screen in a daze and clenched her fist in disbelief. Then she saw the man pull the trigger in a very manly manner, and heard countless men and women screaming in fear from the TV screen. She screamed sadly, and tears flowed down her cheeks. She pushed open the door and ran out of the hospital. It was still some time from here to Parliament Hill. The pink nurse's cap that looked like a small boat was blown off by the wind and fell to the ground. It still looked like a boat, but it also looked like a flower petal, West Woods, Sunset State. Sulu sat on the sofa with a gloomy expression. His head was very low, so low that it was between his knees. He stared at the selfie on his phone that looked like a brutalist oil painting style and let out a strange cry. He asked loudly, "Now you should know where he is, right?" This sentence was directed to the Federal Central Computer. Sulu felt that it was inconceivable that the old thing couldn't find Shurqinghai after such a long time. He couldn't help but feel a little angry. The target is at Parliament Hill, in that famous luxurious toilet. He's moving out now. After knowing the phone number, the Federal Central Computer marked Shurqinghai's latest location in the shortest time possible with the help of the chip in the phone. Sulu tried to call back. As expected, Shurqinghai chose a one-way data connection. There was no way for him to call back. After pondering for a moment, Sulu furrowed his brows tightly and made a call to the members of the Capital Special District. He said in a deep voice, "Gongzi Shur is at Parliament Hill. You guys go over and keep an eye on him for me. Find out what happened. If there is no problem, tie him up and don't let him move." A few minutes later, with the old thing's reminder, Sulu turned on the TV and saw the awards ceremony on the live broadcast. The beautiful man made an interesting and powerful statement about his citizens' right to arrest. He lowered his head and rubbed his face helplessly. He dialed Gu Shifeng's number again and said in a deep voice, "I've confirmed that he's at Parliament Hill. There should be a battle soon. Be careful. Try not to show yourself. Lie in ambush outside and see if there's a chance to help him escape." The live broadcast on the Federation News Channel came to an abrupt end. Su Li's eyes turned dark. The last scene before that was of Shurqinghai holding 2 submachine guns in Parliament Hill. A councilman was lying on the ground, covered in blood. Sulu narrowed his eyes and said emotionlessly, "Give me the camera." After a moment of silence, the Federal Central Computer transferred the internal surveillance video of Parliament Hill to his brain. Sulu narrowed his eyes and looked at the sunlight of the Westwood Sunset State. In fact, he was looking at Parliament Hill billions of astronomical units away. He was looking at the beautiful man in the dark green military trench coat fighting a bloody battle. Pursing his lips and taking deep breaths, Sulu held the heavy handgun tightly with both hands and slowly aimed it at his chin. The cold barrel of the gun sank deep into his skin. As long as his index finger moved slightly and gently pulled the trigger, the fatal bullet would penetrate his skull and fly out with his skull, flesh, and brain matter. It was a scene of panic. The ground was filled with smoke and dust, and precious wood pieces were flying everywhere. Shurqinghai, with a calm face, kept shooting. From time to time, people would fall in a pool of blood in front of him, regardless of whether they were a councilman or someone else. The officers of the Iron 7th Division who received the commendation were the first to react. However, they didn't have any weapons with them, so most of the officers ran out of Parliament Hill. The remaining 2 officers fearlessly rushed over, trying to use their bodies to block Shurqinghai's massacre of the councilmen. Shurqinghai stretched out his arms and calmly suppressed the guards who rushed into the hall. However, this gave the 2 officers a chance to get close to him. The dark green military trench coat seemed to be facing a strong wind. With a whistling sound, the hem suddenly swayed. His right leg shot out from the hem like lightning and kicked the officer's lower abdomen. Almost at the same time, his waist and abdomen used the force of the recoil to pass under his armpit with the submachine gun on his right hand, sweeping across with terrifying gunfire. In an instant, the officer of the Iron 7th Division who attacked from behind had his thigh cut off neatly from the middle. With a muffled cry, he knelt on the ground, blood spurting out of the terrible wound. Sharp alarms rang in Parliament Hill. The guards rushed in, and so did the agents of the Federation Bureau of Investigation and the Special Task Force who had been stationed at the periphery of Parliament Hill for many years. Accompanied by the screams and cries of the fleeing crowd, the sound of bullets whistling through the air was everywhere. Hard dust splashed on the walls and chairs from time to time, and new holes were formed. In the face of such a situation, Mr. Sher was very calm. In fact, he was very calm. It was as if he didn't care that the shrapnel that flew under his earlobe would break his cervical vertebrae if it was slightly off target. He also didn't care how many elite police officers were blocking his way. He calmly raised his gun, aimed, and fired. He calmly, quickly, and accurately reloaded. He crouched on his left knee and dodged, using the heel of his sturdy military boot as an axis to roll. He also fired while rolling, displaying all the military skills he had learned in the 1st Military Academy in Green Dragon Mountain perfectly. He didn't make a single mistake. In addition, there seemed to be an endless supply of ammunition in his dark green military trench coat. From time to time, some of the Federation guards and agents would fall with blood splattering everywhere. Gradually, the rain of bullets became sparse, and he was actually suppressing them all by himself. When Sher Qinghai rushed to the giant stone pillar at the main entrance of Parliament Hill, Vice President Byron had already arrived at the bottom of the stone steps under the protection of the Special Task Force agents. He was about to get into the special bulletproof car. Police lights flashed and sirens sounded. Dozens of police cars had already gathered at Charter Square at the bottom of Parliament Hill. In the distance, more than a dozen black SUVs from the Federation Investigation Bureau were speeding toward them at high speed. The stone steps of Parliament Hill were too long for standard firearms to be able to shoot accurately. At least, the gun in Sher Qinghai's dark green military trench coat, which was dripping with blood, couldn't do that. Sher Qinghai held the gun with both hands and squinted at the special bulletproof car at the bottom of the stone steps, as well as the chubby vice president of the Federation beside the car. At that moment, Vice President Byron seemed to have sensed something. He turned around and glanced at the entrance of Parliament Hill. His expression was calm, and his attitude was calm. Sher Qinghai loosened his grip, and the two empty submachine guns fell to the ground with a clatter. Then, they rolled down the high and long stone steps toward the bottom of Parliament Hill, as if they were helplessly crashing into an empty stone. He reached out his right hand to adjust his glasses, raised his thumb, and straightened his index finger like a child, and pointed his finger at Vice President Byron, who was at the bottom of the stone steps. At the same time, he said softly, "Bang." Vice President Byron shook his head and smiled sarcastically. He was about to get into the car. At that moment, the noisy Charter Square suddenly fell into an eerie silence. It was probably because of a strange buzzing sound in the air, and a loud bang in the air in front of Parliament Hill. Bang! Vice President Byron still had a sarcastic smile on his face, but the bottom half of his body was blasted into a pool of blood by the terrifying bullet flying from outer space. On the stone steps, Sher Qinghai retracted his index finger and pursed his lips. It was a mess of purple and red. Chapter 724. In front of Parliament Hill, in Charter Square, police lights were flashing non-stop. Although it was daytime, the sun behind the spring clouds was not as eye-catching as the colorful lights. Sharp sirens and equally ear-piercing emergency brakes sounded from time to time. Countless agents from powerful government departments were nervously setting up defenses everywhere. On the stone steps, Sher Qinghai retracted his index finger. Above the square, there was a dull but loud gunshot that sounded like a sudden clap of thunder. However, it did not stop. It was not slow, and it was frightening. It was extremely rough and even seemed a little clumsy, but it was also extremely terrifying. Vice President Byron, whose lower body was directly blasted into a flower of blood, was sent flying more than 10 meters away. He lay in a pool of blood, and it was unknown whether he was dead or alive. The special police agents crawled on the ground, shouting loudly as they crawled over. Bang! 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 The bullets from the big gun from afar actually hit the special bulletproof car. The hard bulletproof glass shattered, and the alloy car made a cracking sound. The huge impact made the car bounce up from the ground and then fall down. Not long after, the car was as if it was run over by a heavy hydraulic press. It was shot into a pile of scrap metal by the dense and terrifying bullets. The ACW was probably the only single long-range weapon in this universe that could directly penetrate the defense of military mecha. In front of it, any bulletproof car was like a paper toy. About 2,300 meters away from the stone steps of Parliament Hill, on the corner of the roof of an unremarkable old building in the southwest corner of Charter Square, the ACW covered with standard green twisted leaves was quietly aimed at the square below. It blended in with the dense ivy on the wall, making it extremely difficult to be discovered. Only when the green leaves occasionally revealed a towering metallic luster and biting cold air would people be alarmed. This was the federal military's most powerful and most expensive single long-range weapon. The ACW was preloaded with ammunition, electronic pulse ignition, single-barreled composite system, 3-point shooting time limited to 1/500 th of a second. Coupled with the tungsten alloy tail fins and the addition of the magnetic vibration killing effect, it was undoubtedly a good killing weapon to destroy mechas and planes. Due to the special nature of today's mission, Qinghai had chosen an ordinary cartridge box with a large amount of ammunition. Next to the cartridge box, there was a smooth adaptive helicometer placed on top of a balanced base plate, which was connected to a high-performance workbench through a data cable. After receiving the data from the front, the workbench only needed a very short time to accurately calculate the shooting angle. Coupled with the comprehensive monitoring of wind speed and humidity, the precision of the remote firing could be controlled to a certain extent. With a muffled sound, the bullet spurted out from the thick barrel, and the heavy body of the gun retreated along the slide at high speed. It heavily hit the shock absorber and then repositioned itself. When the bullet tore through the air and exploded with a terrifying thunder in the sky above Charter Square, the thick black barrel of the ACW had already finished adjusting the shooting angle according to the calculation. The muzzle quickly and smoothly raised or lowered its head silently, and continued to spew out the second bullet. As the muzzle of the gun continued to spew out flames, the air above the balcony of this ordinary apartment building in the southwest corner of Charter Square seemed to have started to become anxious. The beautiful and quiet deep creepers had slightly curled up leaves and were trembling incessantly. Qinghai took out the gun in his military windbreaker as fast as he could. He turned around and looked at the police officer hiding behind the stone pillar in the 7:00 direction. His left hand's finger lightly pressed, and the sensitive red pulse button was triggered with a click. The terrifying ACW on the apartment building in the distance collected the signal from the glasses, and the signal from the chip in the windbreaker completed a triangular physical positioning calculation in a very short time, adjusted the shooting angle, and then fired. Bang! With a loud bang, an obvious hole appeared in the concrete pillar. In the midst of the flying debris, the police officer was covered in blood, and he rolled out with a miserable howl. The glasses on the bridge of the nose would be displaced, and this kind of long-distance calculation would ultimately have a deviation. Therefore, the ACW's shooting this time wasn't perfect, but with its terrifying power, it was enough to complete the tactical requirements. Qinghai looked at the police cars that had completely surrounded the square. His face was expressionless, but his eyebrows were slightly furrowed. His eyes looked through the glasses at the police officers and the investigators from the Federation Investigation Bureau who were preparing to rush over at the bottom of the long stone steps. He started to quickly press the red button on his pinky finger. Bang, bang, bang. Countless dense loud noises sounded from the inside of Parliament Hill and the open area in front of it. Amidst the terrifying roar, more than a dozen police cars at the front were shot full of holes. Metal pieces flew everywhere, revealing the miserable steel frames and broken engines inside. Cement blocks and dust were blown up from the hard ground by the powerful bullets. From time to time, a police car would explode into flames and black smoke. Some vehicles flew high up into the air, only to fall heavily and shatter into pieces. Under the suppression of such a dense and terrifying rain of bullets, none of the people in front of Parliament Hill could counterattack. All the police officers and investigators dodged in all directions, rolling and crawling quickly, retreating to the grassy field behind them. The police officers and investigators who still had the ability to fight in the Parliament Hill Hall were directly scared out of their wits by the rain of bullets. They hid in the corners far away, not daring to raise their heads. If they dared to poke their heads out, even if there were no bullets, the extremely sharp and dangerous cement blocks would directly tear them into pieces. Smoke and dust rose, and flames gradually rose. Beside the stone pillar of the charred Parliament Hill Hall, Shi Qinghai, wearing glasses and wearing a dark green military windbreaker, looked left and right. He let the bullets fly, and made everyone lie down in front of him, not daring to stand. All the TV stations had already cut off the live broadcast. Under the suppression of the Federation government's anger, the news media could only report in real time about everything that happened in front of Parliament Hill. They couldn't even publish pictures. However, Charter Square itself was the most famous tourist destination of the Federation. Today was a good spring day, and countless residents of the capital special district and foreign tourists were taking photos with the statue of the Group of Five, offering flowers to the statue of the military god, sitting on the grass, and occasionally feeding a few pieces of bread to the greedy fat pigeons. The sudden shooting incident startled all the tourists. They panicked and fled in all directions. After entering the safe zone, they stood outside the yellow police cordon temporarily set up by the police station. Looking at the billowing black smoke in the direction of Parliament Hill and hearing the dense gunshots, they were shocked speechless. They all took out their cell phones and reported to their family or friends about the unbelievable incident that was happening here. Thunderous rumbles resounded above the heads of the thousands of citizens. They subconsciously raised their heads to look, only to see several federal military aircraft whistling through the air at a low altitude with astonishing momentum. They actually sent out fighter jets. What exactly is going on at Parliament Hill? Is it the suicide attack team of the anti-government army in Green Dragon Mountain? Or are they religious fanatics from Bermuda? The people were more and more shocked. Then, they saw more than a dozen fully armed armored vehicles driving at high speed on the street at the northeast corner of Charter Square. Behind the armored vehicles was an ordinary military vehicle. In the back seat of the military vehicle, the new leader of the Iron 7th Division's Rapid Response Disposal Team, Major Chang, quickly reported to the general beside him in a low voice. The Special Police and the Federation Investigation Department's response team have already tried to infiltrate twice. According to the report, only sporadic gunshots were heard, and then there was no other movement. They should have failed. Major Chang regretfully missed the opportunity to attack the Empire with the troops because of his leg injury. Instead, he was left in the base by his division commander to take care of related matters. Therefore, he was not qualified to participate in the award ceremony today. Instead, he accompanied his division commander to check the equipment needed for the next expedition. According to the current situation, no one in the division should have died yet, but Colonel Shimin is missing. Major Chang looked at the hologram in his hand and continued quickly, the enemy has hostages. Their firepower is too strong, and their professional military accomplishments are extremely high. The Federation government is unable to deal with them, so they asked us to take over. The Federation actually needs to send out field troops for internal affairs. This is very dangerous, and even more so, a disgrace. Du Shaoqing, who had been silent all this time, looked in the direction of Parliament Hill. Thinking of the phone call he received earlier, he suddenly asked, "Are you sure it's Qinghai?" "Yes, it's confirmed." Major Chang hesitated for a moment and added, "Commander, I heard from Instructor Su Lo that this person is qualified to enter the Trinity Association. He is very capable. The standard suppressive fire angle is impeccable, and the flawless tactical movements and intentions are chosen perfectly." Du Shaoqing looked at Parliament Hill in the distance and thought of the man wearing the dark green military trench coat shooting silently on the surveillance screen just now. He sighed and said, "It is my regret that such an outstanding soldier can't fight for the Federation." After a moment of silence, this famous Federation general said softly, "Be quick. If it takes too long to use troops to deal with one person, I can't afford to lose face." The Federation mobilized troops to deal with that beautiful man on Parliament Hill, so the battle naturally ended very quickly. When the armored vehicles of the Iron 7th Division surrounded Parliament Hill, several MX mechas extended their tail fins and descended from the transport aircraft at high speed, approaching the big gun hidden in the creeper. The battle was actually already over. Du Shaoqing, who was sitting in a military vehicle in the distance, maintained his usual valiant military style. He didn't make any arrangements, and the fierce and unreasonable cannon fire crossed the long stone steps and blasted towards the main entrance of Parliament Hill. Amidst the roar, smoke and dust filled the air above the stone steps of Parliament Hill. The people behind the square let out countless cries of alarm, worried that this magnificent building would collapse just like that. Parliament Hill didn't collapse, but the rolling debris and smoke and dust obscured the people's vision. Inside the building, Qinghai dragged his injured leg and wiped away the blood gushing out from his nose. He smiled as he spat on the ground and walked back behind the door. He found half a glass of sparkling apple wine in the messy wine tower and finished it in one gulp to quench his thirst. Chapter 725. The wings on the back of the black military MX mecha reflected the blue sky, white clouds, and gem-like light. It whistled through the air as it descended, approaching the apartment building covered in green plants at its fastest speed. In that instant, the ACW muzzle hidden by the ivy and green twisted leaves seemed to have undergone some sort of minor adjustment, but in the end, it did not fire a bullet. The strong and sturdy mechanical arm directly smashed a corner of the apartment building, and the big gun with a metallic luster spat out a whining bullet, chirping like a dying bird as it fell from the balcony with the ivy wrapped around it. The apartment building could not withstand the terrifying weight of the military mech at all, and the corner of the balcony instantly cracked, the hard concrete and steel of the wall making a clear cracking sound. Seeing that the entire structure of the apartment building was about to be severely damaged, the elite pilot of the Iron 7 Division decisively made an extremely difficult mecha somersault move. He skillfully maneuvered the MX mecha to quickly leave the wall, and with the reaction force of the jet stream thrusters, the mecha began to fall towards the street. The square West Street that was under traffic control was already empty of all vehicles, and there was not a single person in sight. The heavy military MX mecha smashed heavily onto the ground. Its two thick alloy mechanical legs stomped fiercely, and the multidimensional cavity hydraulic valves at its knees let out an ear-piercing screech as if they were about to burst open at any moment. A moment later, this military mech finally stood up with difficulty, not falling over, leaving two deep, shattered craters in the black square West Street. The wind howled, and the military MX mech quickly adjusted its combat posture, joining up with the other three MX mechs, and speeding towards the stone steps at the entrance of the Parliament Hill building. From the moment these pure black military mecha appeared, the Federation citizens watching from afar began to cry out in surprise. This was especially so when they saw the mecha, which was almost 7 meters tall, land on the roof of the apartment building and then fall down heavily. In the end, when the black mecha landed safely on the ground, a round of spontaneous applause rang out from the crowd. This was the first time a Federation military mech appeared in a combat posture, not as a tourist attraction, in front of the citizens, in a city of the capital ring. The enthusiastic applause of the people expressed their trust and admiration for the Federal Army and their love for the Iron 7th Division. But for the man in Parliament Hill, the applause might have represented the arrival of death. The wine tower had long been destroyed by the bullets, so it was not easy to find a glass of wine. After drinking it in one gulp, Shi Qinghai took off his dark green military windbreaker and wiped his hands that were a little sticky from the apple sparkling wine. He found that the blood on the windbreaker was actually more sticky than the wine. The optical display on the glasses was the image of the outside world captured by the autonomous monitoring system of Parliament Hill. Shi Qinghai quietly looked at the 4 black MX mechas outside the building. There were more than 100 fully armed Federation soldiers. He knew that there was no way out for him. He looked at the epaulets on the dark green military windbreaker in his hand and thought of his comrades in Green Dragon Mountain. He thought of how when he first joined the organization, he had once imagined that one day he would lead his troops into Parliament Hill. Today, he was already standing on Parliament Hill and slaughtering everyone. A smile involuntarily appeared on his handsome face that in the distant sunset state of the West Woods, Sulu still maintained that strange and dangerous posture. He narrowed his eyes and looked out the window. The muzzle of the gun sunk deep into his chin. He was facing death. It was only now that he realized that the sunlight outside the window was fake. It was an illusion caused by the lights in the old house because it was not warm at all. "I'm sorry, but I can't do as you ask," the Federal Central Computer repeated in his mind. "Why not?" Sulu held the pistol tightly with both hands. His eyes were narrowed. The hard and cold muzzle was so deep that it hurt and started to heat up. "I know you have the ability. I will only protect you according to the first sequence authority, but I can't kill anyone because of your orders. This violates the 3 laws of the core program." The Central Computer's answer was firm. The authority of any sequence must be under the 3 laws. "I didn't ask you to kill anyone." Sulu moved his wrist slightly and roared angrily in a low voice, "You can destroy the command system of the Federation Investigation Department and the Special Task Force. You can prevent them from seeing what's going on in Parliament Hill. You can help him leave. I can't do that. Don't use such words to brush me off, at least not in front of me." Sulu narrowed his eyes and stared at the reflection on the window. He said, "I know you've done direct physical operations before." It was obvious that the Central Computer's tone became sharp because of these words. "The only direct physical operation I've done in the Federation was when I helped you drive the mecha for a period of time while you were unconscious on Flight 5460. I admit that I shouldn't have been curious about the feeling of direct physical operation, but this doesn't mean that you can authorize me to do any kind of physical operation." After a pause, the old man said calmly, "I will protect your life according to the first sequence authority, but I can't help you become a god above the Federation. I've never thought of using you to gain any benefits." Sulu adjusted his posture and used his finger to slowly release the safety of the pistol. He panted slightly and said, "For my own sake, I'm only asking you this once." The Central Computer replied, "If I destroy the mechanical and electronic equipment of the Federation, then the police, agents, and soldiers of the Federation may be killed, or greatly increase the chances of them dying." "You've helped me kill people before," Sulu said with his head lowered. "That's the Empire's people. The Empire's people aren't people. The revised 3 laws do state so. If my life is threatened, will you stop those mechas and those electronic equipment?" "Yes." "Then what are you hesitating for?" Sulu raised his chin slightly, his index finger gripping the trigger tightly. He said, "If you don't do it, I'll kill myself. When the other party doesn't directly threaten your life, I can't do anything that threatens the safety of the other party's life. According to the logic in the core program, even if you pull the trigger now, I can only judge that you have the intention to end your life. I will respect your wishes and will not interfere. After a pause, the central computer said seriously, Su-Lo, all lives are equal. No, Professor Shen taught me that there is no reason in the universe. It seems that all lives have never been equal, so you will have a sequence of authority. Humans have close and distant relationships. Su Li's brows were tightly knitted, and he suppressed his anger and said in a deep voice, I also have my close and distant relationships. In the corner upstairs, Zhong Huiyan, who was wearing pajamas, hugged the old doll tightly. She looked at Su-Lo arguing with the air angrily under the light. She looked at the pistol he aimed at her chin and felt very scared. At this moment, the phone rang. The noisy and chaotic Charter Square gradually quieted down because the Iron 7th Division strongly requested all the Federation government departments to turn off the police lights and sirens. The thin clouds in the sky were pushed to the west by the spring wind. The smoke was blown away, and the sight in the square became much clearer. In the military vehicle set up as the temporary headquarters, Du Xiaoqing looked at his subordinates with a calm and slightly mocking expression. He waved the plan in his hand, shook his head and said, Do you think this is a war with the Imperial Royal Army? There is only one person in the Parliament building, and the General Staff is seriously coming up with a plan. Are you all idiots? No one dared to say anything. Because of the video in their hands, and because some of their colleagues were seriously injured by that person, the officers of the Iron 7th Division, who were urgently transferred by the military to deal with this incident, took it very seriously and seriously came up with a very complicated attack plan. According to this plan, even if Shi Qinghai was a monster, he would still be turned into a pile of meat paste. Because there are hostages in the building, we attack by force. Du Xiaoqing's gaze was cold as he stared at the staff officers and said in a low voice, Who can explain this logic? The staff officer stepped forward and explained, The target is already surrounded, and he knows very well that there is no chance of him escaping. According to the analysis of the target in the relevant files, he will definitely not surrender. Then, in this desperate situation, he is very likely to go berserk and start slaughtering the hostages. So the General Staff recommends organizing a strong attack as soon as possible. According to the blueprint sent by the Ministry of Construction, the MX Mecha should not affect the overall structure of Parliament Mountain if they force their way through. Give up on the attack plan. Let's wait for this person to surrender or commit suicide. Du Xiaoqing looked at the doubtful eyes of his subordinates and calmly explained, Shi Qinghai is not a person who likes to kill. If he had already lost his mind, then the half-arc of dense suppression by ACW wouldn't have only destroyed 20 or so police cars. I'm afraid that hundreds of police officers would have been killed by him. Right at this moment, there was a sudden commotion in Charter Square. An officer shouted in surprise, The target is out. On the surveillance screen, Shi Qinghai walked out from the entrance of Parliament Mountain, which was still emitting black smoke. There was not a single visible wound on his body, but he was covered in blood. He used his right arm to wipe his nose continuously, the gun in his hand swinging around casually. A casual and gentle smile hung on his face as he slowly and steadily walked down the long stone steps towards the square. None of the soldiers and police officers who had long surrounded Parliament Mountain like an iron bucket dared to shoot, because his left arm was wrapped around a girl as a hostage. For those police officers and Federation Investigation Bureau agents who had been shot until their eyes were red, as long as they could turn Shi Qinghai into a hornet's nest, they did not care about the life or death of the hostage. But the problem was, the Iron 7th Division was in charge of the entire situation. The snipers set up on top of the buildings around Charter Square, especially on the Ministry building next to Parliament Mountain, were already in position, ready to shoot at any time. The final order to kill the target had to be given by the highest commander present. The officer of the Iron 7th Division looked at the silent Commander Du Shaoqing and reported, "The square is wide and the line of sight is excellent. The one-shot kill rate has exceeded 95%. We are ready to execute the order at any time." Du Shaoqing silently looked at the blood-soaked man on the hologram. He looked at the girl hostage in his arms. He looked at the little red flower on the girl's head. He said indifferently, "No one is allowed to open fire." "Why, Commander?" the staff officer asked in surprise. Du Shaoqing picked up the coffee cup and said calmly, "Because I don't want Minister Zhou's daughter to be killed by you, and I don't want to give Su Lu a legitimate reason to go crazy." Chapter 726. On the long stone steps, Shi Qinghai squinted his eyes to look at the top of the building. He felt that the sunlight was a little blinding. He smiled at the girl in his arms and said, "Slow down. My leg is injured, so I can't keep up. I really don't know what kind of bad luck I have to carry you for such a long distance." Zhou Yu was expressionless. Her charming face was cold in the spring breeze. "Speaking of which, I really need to thank you." Shi Qinghai smiled and said, "You said that there were so many enthusiastic onlookers squatting in the seats like field mice. You were the only one who stood up bravely and took on the important task of carrying me down the stairs. I don't know why I didn't think it through at that time." Zhou Yu said with a calm expression, "If the heavens give me another chance, I will definitely watch you die," with a smile. The thin clouds above Charter Square had already dispersed. The clear spring sunlight shone on the stone steps of Parliament Hill. Looking at the solemn statue on the green lawn in the center of the square, the young couple walked together as naturally as if they were walking on a meadow in the Highlands. Just by listening to the conversation between the two, people would definitely think that this was a couple who was still in the warm period and had some small grudges but could still love each other. Before seeing the heavily damaged entrance of Parliament Hill and the armed soldiers in the square, no one would have thought that they were being targeted by a few high-precision sniper rifles. Holding the girl in his arms. No, it was using his elbow to choke the girl's throat. The casually swinging handgun could turn the girl into a corpse at any time. Zhou Yu was Shi Qinghai's hostage. The Minister of Defense's daughter was his only weapon against the sniper rifles on the platform of the building in the distance, as well as the heavy mechas below the stone steps. At least, that was what the onlookers, soldiers, and police thought. The young man and woman walked down the long stone steps, walked past the shallow pond, and walked across the green grass. There were no sudden gunshots in the quiet Charter Square, nor were there any screams. Only countless pairs of eyes followed them nervously. Shi Qinghai walked very slowly because he was very tired. However, in the eyes of others, his slow walk with Zhou Yu in his arms turned into a kind of calmness. After walking into the spacious square, he and Zhou Yu, who was in his arms, looked like they were taking a stroll under the clear sun. The onlookers could only see his back, so the crowd started to move along with the yellow police tape. As for those armed military police, of course, they had been holding their guns and were nervously following them not far away. For the first time, Shi Qinghai felt that Charter Square was really fucking huge. His feet were so sore, but he still hadn't reached his destination. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the row of giant statues in front of him that the Federation people were very familiar with. His vision blurred for a moment, and he couldn't help but laugh at himself and mumble something in a low voice. Zhou Yu, who was in his arms, slightly frowned. She let the light breeze blow her beautiful black hair in front of her forehead. Her right hand was a little uneasy. She nervously blocked the cold gun next to her neck, as if she wanted to futilely block the bullets that might be shot. She had to show the fear that a hostage should have. In fact, her right hand was gently holding the gun in Shi Qinghai's hand. Otherwise, the gun might fall to the ground in the next moment. Woman, can you tell me the real answer now that I have something to ask you? Shi Qinghai half leaned on her back. It seemed that he was using her body to block the line of fire of the military police. In fact, only he knew that without Zouyu's support, it would be difficult for him to continue walking. He leaned close to her crystal-clear earlobe like a jade pendant. His face was expressionless, but his voice was extremely frivolous. He asked, "Why don't you want to marry such a perfect man like me? You haven't changed your mind for several years. You know that our son can already recite poems." "That's my son," Zouyu habitually retorted in a cold voice, just like when the two of them met privately for dinner. However, the beautiful sunlight reflected by the statue in front of her, the stern-looking soldiers nearby, and the shocked crowd in the distance made her realize that this was Charter Square. The man behind her could die at any time. The tip of her heart finally softened a little. After a moment of silence, a strand of hair floated to her lips with the soft and warm spring breeze. She gently pushed it out with the tip of her tongue and vaguely explained, "Because you like too many women." Shi Qinghai was silent for a while. Suddenly, he smiled and said, "Sulu is the same." Zouyu moved her lips and wanted to smile. But looking at the military police in all directions, as if they were facing a great enemy, the smile turned into a trace of indifference and disappeared from her lips. Under the warm spring sun, under the gazes of thousands of people, under the gunfire, under the countless mobile phone pictures and live videos on the internet, Shi Qinghai walked to the center of Charter Square with Zouyu in his arms. Then, he lifted the iron chain under the statue, walked in, and sat down. The stone steps were a little warm under the spring sun. It was very comfortable to sit on them, especially for Shi Qinghai who was feeling cold. He leaned on Zouyu's shoulder, frowned and looked at the new statue of the military god Li Pifu opposite him. He said something that didn't make sense. "The old man also makes mistakes. You have to eat more. There's no meat on your shoulder blade, so it's not comfortable to lean on it." Above the two of them was the famous group of 5 sculptures. The huge bronze sculptures didn't have many marks left by the baptism of time, but they naturally had a sense of vicissitudes. The fresh sunlight sprinkled on the sculptures, reflected on the big clock in front of them, and then scattered naturally on the grass. There was a fascinating smell of old wine in the air. A yellow police line surrounded the group of sculptures. The soldiers of the Iron 7th Division surrounded the area with guns. Probably because the sun was too good and the walk was too smooth, the atmosphere in the square was not as tense as before. In the corner of the square further away, Du Shaoqing walked out of the military vehicle and slowly took off his sunglasses. Looking at the comfortable sunlight, he revealed a rare gentle smile. "So you didn't pay attention to the nonsense of the man behind her?" She asked expressionlessly. "You killed the vice president of the Federation. You can't escape. Why did you come here?" A few drops of warm blood gushed out from his nose. Shi Qinghai wanted to wipe it away, but his reaction was slower because of his tired body. The blood fell on Zouyu's bulging chest covered by her thin sweater. "I'm sorry," he said. "It's okay," she said. "When I was young, the school received a special grant from the Ministry of Education to take all of us students to visit Charter Square. What's there to see in this square? Other than the 2 museums, there are probably only the sculptures of the group of 5. At that time, the army god was still alive and well. He hadn't been beaten by the wind and rain by those unfilial descendants." Shi Qinghai smiled mockingly. He raised his left arm and wiped the blood on his lips. He continued, "Of the group of 5, I admire the biologist Wenjun Brandy the most. You should be able to guess the reason. This sage loved drinking so much that the most famous wine in the Federation was named after him. But I only like to drink number 1. And at that time, I was still an elementary school student and didn't know that wine was delicious. My question about the sculptures was why the one on the left was wearing a skirt. Shi Qinghai recalled seriously. He pointed at the majestic bronze sculpture above his head. Because she was the only woman in the group of 5, and she was good at computer design. Zhou Yu hugged her knees and looked at the grass in the cracks of the square floor. She answered softly, although the sculpture was in her middle age, women always like to wear skirts. Yes. Shi Qinghai licked his dry lips and said, I just don't understand. The sculpture was dozens of meters high, and she had to wear a skirt. Wasn't she afraid of being exposed? Zhou Yu didn't say anything. At that time, I wanted to go through the railing and take a look below her, but I was pulled back by the guards. Our principal criticized me. Shi Qinghai said with emotion, so this has become a mystery in my life. Did she expose herself? What kind of underwear did the sculptor prepare for her? Zhou Yu was speechless. Today, I finally have the opportunity to see it in person. I feel very happy. After saying this, Shi Qinghai naturally looked up. After looking carefully for a long time, he said with emotion, she didn't wear underwear. Zhou Yu had to say something. She stared at the gap between her knees and said, now that the situation is like this, can't you care about something more serious? I just want to say that the group of 5 is also an ordinary person. We are all ordinary people. Shi Qinghai said with a smile, it's just that we can do some extraordinary things occasionally. Like now. Zhou Yu frowned and asked. Yes. Thinking that all the women in my life who gave me happiness and beauty can see me again on TV, and that what I did today can provide her with countless sentimental memories in her later years, I feel that this trip was not in vain, not in vain. Shi Qinghai dragged the last word very long, very soft, and very sincere. Zhou Yu bit her bright lower lip and said with annoyance, the TV station will definitely not broadcast it live. Don't worry, so many of our friends have mobile phones with cameras. Then he waved to the onlookers who were holding phones and taking photos outside the yellow cordon. The sun was so good, the sun was just right. Shi Qinghai's left hand was around her lower abdomen, and his right hand was around her upper arm, holding the pistol tightly. He rested his head on her shoulder. It seemed intimate, but in fact, it was weak. Or perhaps it was weak, but it was a rare intimacy after the irresponsible intimacy in the snowy night in Linhai. He leaned on Zhou Yu's shoulder and looked at the warm sun with narrowed eyes. His body felt warm and very comfortable. He couldn't help but think of a few years ago, when he had killed Macklin at the Huanshan Four States Foundation building. He had sat under the sun with Su Lo and smoked a very strong cigarette. I miss Su Lo. Help me light a cigarette, and then help me make a call. The flattened number 37 brand cigarette was lit up in the flame. Shi Qinghai took a deep breath, his lips like purple orchids. Then, he hugged Zhou Yu and refused to let her go shamelessly. Chapter 727. The smoke on the long stone steps of Parliament Hill had dissipated. The sun was shining brightly on the grass behind the green chairs in Charter Square. The silent onlookers watched attentively from behind the yellow cordon. The armed military police were maintaining order. Looking at the young couple sitting under the statue of the 5-person team, this scene looked very much like the set of a romance movie, not a killing field of life and death. Leaning on the girl's shoulder, Shi Qinghai bit on the cigarette and narrowed his eyes, reminiscing about the past. This cigarette was not as powerful as the one in the Golden Foundation building, but it was warmer. After a few beeps, the call was connected. The signal through the stars couldn't get an immediate answer, so the other side was silent. In this silence, his beautiful purple lips moved slightly, and he began to speak. The people on the list, I killed Byron, and I shot Paulson twice. He was very sleepy, seriously counting the heads, and continued to speak into the phone in Zhou hand. There are still some things that I haven't finished, so I'll leave them to you. I'm on a dead end, so I did things so ruthlessly, leaving those old men with no way out. You're not me, so you can walk more steadily. After a moment of silence, Shi Qinghai pursed his lips and blew gently, messing up the hair in front of his forehead with the wind. He said with a charming smile, "These are all trivial matters. The next thing is serious. There are some things that I need you to do for me. You know that I have many girlfriends, but they don't need you to care about them. But 2 days ago, I owed a favor to Xiaosu. You must remember to help me pay it back. Help me bully her ex-boyfriend. Her name is Wu Li, and she works at the Army General Hospital." Zhou sat in front of him silently on the cold stone steps, her head down, not saying a word. Shi Qinghai looked at her crystal-clear earlobes that were like jade pendants in her hair, and continued to order the small-eyed man on the other end of the phone, "Help me take care of my son, and this evil woman." He coughed twice, and blood flowed out from his nose, dripping onto Zhou's chest and onto the ground. Zhou, who was in his arms, lowered her head and hugged her slightly trembling knees. Tears finally overflowed from her eyes and dripped onto the ground, mixing with the blood of the man behind her. The crowd outside the cordon let out a low cry. Seeing the beautiful girl begin to cry, they couldn't help but worry. The soldiers of the Iron 7th Division thought that the hostages were about to break down and were ready to attack at any time. However, the highest-ranking officer in the corner of the square was sitting silently on the couple's chair. He did not give any orders and slowly tasted the taste of the coarse tobacco under the sun. The military officer behind the chair walked to him with the phone. Du Xiaoqing calmly took the phone and listened to the direct order from the higher-ups, but the expression on his face did not change. "Why haven't you acted yet? Don't you know that the most important thing to deal with a terrorist incident is time? Now that the internet is in chaos, the emergency plan can't deal with the spread of rumors at all." Du Xiaoqing silently listened to the stern questioning of a certain director on the other end of the phone. He did not open his mouth to speak. "Commander Du Xiaoqing, I order you to carry out a surprise attack immediately and kill the criminals. The safety of the hostages is important, but are the people who died in Parliament Hill not important? If you continue to delay, it means that you are committing a crime. As a soldier." Du Xiaoqing slowly put on his sunglasses, stood up, and calmly said to the other end of the phone, "I have always thought that the politicians in Parliament Hill are all scumbags." After a moment of silence, the director solemnly said, "Including Colonel Shimin." Under the wide sunglasses, it was obvious that Du Xiaoqing's straight nose was wrinkled in disgust. He did not answer the question, but slowly closed his eyes for a very long time. Outside the famous chain coffee shop in the corner of the square, the usually lively outdoor area was extremely quiet at the moment. The waiters wore dark green aprons, which looked very similar to the Federation's military uniform. Although they were not soldiers, they could not leave like the guests. They had to stick to their posts. They could only nervously look at the center of the square and the phone screen in their hands, paying attention to the instant news that refreshed from time to time. Under a large parasol in the shadow of the corner, Gu Shifeng stared at the empty coffee cup in front of her and said in a low voice, "The 7th Division is the one who dealt with the incident. Du Xiaoqing is personally in command. How can we save people with just a few people?" And looking at the young master's behavior, it seems that there is no plan to leave at all. Where can we go to help? Did Da Vinci enter the sewers? Xiong Linquan said in a low voice, the clear water cup in front of him humming. There are a total of 47 sewer entrances around the square. If he can get close to any of the 3 entrances next to the statue, there is still a possibility. Gu Shifeng frowned and covered the miniature communicator in her ear. She shook her head in disappointment and said, "He can't find a chance. The 7th Division is too strict. All the entrances are guarded. Xiong Linquan lowered his head in silence and looked at the black box at his feet. Gu Shifink shook her head firmly. Impulsiveness can't solve the problem. Xiong Linquan cursed in a low voice. He raised his head and frowned at the center of the square in the distance. He looked at the faintly visible figure of the man below the statue and roared angrily, "What is this young master thinking? If he wants to escape from the Parliament Hill building, there are many choices. Why does he have to choose a dead end?" The call to the West Woods ended. Shi Qinghai had finished telling that guy what to do. Because of the delay, there was no way to hear that guy's voice. He smiled regretfully and took the cigarette back from Zhou Yu's hand. He handed the phone back to her, but then took it back. No one noticed that he had passed something small to her. The spring sun was charming, just like the women in his life. Shi Qinghai was satisfied with the warmth and quiet sleepiness. He pressed close to Zhou Yu's back and was about to say something fierce to end this legendary spring performance when he inadvertently glanced at someone crying in the crowd in the distance. His vision was sometimes a little blurry, but sometimes it was clearer than before. He frowned and looked in that direction, looking at 2 girls crying in the crowd. One of the girls was wearing a light pink nurse's uniform, but the cute hat on her head was gone. Her black hair was slightly messy, and she was crying her heart out under the surprised gazes of the people around her. The other girl was standing a little further away. Her face, which had not been seen for a long time, was still as delicate and shy as yesterday. She was holding a few books tightly in her arms. Judging by the size of the books, they were probably school textbooks. Because she was holding them too tightly, her fingers were slightly trembling and pale, and tears were flowing silently. Shi Qinghai's hand that was holding the cigarette froze for a moment. After a while, a sincere smile appeared on his face, and he waved at the crowd on the other side of the warning line again. Then he put down his arms and moved away from Zhou Yu's back with some difficulty. He leaned against the slightly hot bronze statue and sighed comfortably. Then he fell into a dark and sweet dream under the sun. A long silence. Zhou Yu slowly straightened her body that was buried between her knees. She casually tidied her hair and stood up on the stone steps with strength that came out of nowhere. Without looking back or stopping, she walked towards the warning line. The military police around the square called for backup and quickly rushed over. A few of them tried to pull Zhou Yu away from the danger zone as quickly as possible, but they were shocked by her calm and somewhat indifferent expression. No one dared to reach out. Dozens of military police climbed over the railing and surrounded the handsome man who was sleeping soundly on the stone steps. The guns in their hands had already been loaded, and they nervously aimed at his body. An agent from the Federation Investigation Bureau forcibly suppressed the fear in his heart and moved his feet to the front of the man. He reached out his pistol and gently poked his shoulder, but there was no reaction. At this moment, a clear shattering sound suddenly came from the distant Parliament Hill building. The sound was not loud, and no one knew what the problem was. No one knew that inside the Parliament Hill building, in the luxurious washroom with the sign, "Cleaning in Progress," hanging on the door, the remote-controlled explosives behind the urinal had successfully detonated. In the midst of the splashing water, Shiman Jean, who had long fainted, was lifted up by a hard metal wire. She crashed through the glass window and hung on the outer wall of the Parliament Hill building, swaying gently with the spring breeze. At the same time, 3 encrypted messages that had long been set up automatically activated the transmission program and began to be transmitted to the official residence in the West Woods and to an office in the Parliament Hill. Shi Qinghai had died. After her death, she had become an exclamation mark hanging outside the Parliament Hill building. Because of his promise, there were some things that he wanted people to see. In the Charter Square, the military police silently looked at Shi Qinghai, who was leaning against the stone steps and sleeping soundly, and slowly put down the guns in their hands. He opened his palms comfortably. Suddenly, a voice rang from the phone in his palm. The guy who was far away in the West Woods shouted loudly, "Hold on." He did not hear this sentence. He quietly and happily closed his eyes. The cigarette between his left fingers was still burning stubbornly, slowly burning the 3 numbers into ashes. Then they fell into a deep sleep under the sun, in the spring scenery. The police lights flashed again. The sound of sirens and ambulances mixed together was incomparably sharp. Zhou sat in the back of the ambulance with a gray blanket draped over her. There was no trace of expression on her tired face. She did not hear what the doctor beside her was saying at all. She held the little thing tightly in her right hand and calmly looked at the 2 girls who were still crying in the crowd in the distance. Back then, she was a budding seedling that was showing off in the spring breeze. This bunch of seedlings was tall and straight and restrained. It was always pleasing, but not eye-catching. After the death of her fiancé, Park Ji-pao, she returned to her hometown in S3 to relax. However, she was still depressed. When she returned to the beach in S1, she met a man who was as warm as the sun. She accompanied him, or he accompanied her, through the loneliness of that small island. Then they parted. She did not fall in love again because of her dead fiancé and him. She became a teacher. A few days ago, she received a call that made her extremely happy and sad. She carried her teaching materials and prepared to go to the foundation of her friend, Nan Xiangmei, to discuss the education of orphans around the mountains. In the end, she was extremely happy and sad when she saw him in the square. She watched as he smiled at her and then parted again. Her name was Miao Miao. When close friends or family members called her name, they would only think of the 2 words, Miao, in their hearts. The man on the island would only dotingly call her Miao Miao. She was abandoned by her ex-boyfriend who hoped to become a doctor, but she did not give up. She cutely and naively thought of revenge instead of getting back together. She was kind and full of fantasy. She once imagined if a Federation agent suddenly came to her like in the movies. Would a romantic story happen? Every time she thought of this, the cute freckles on the bridge of her nose would be exceptionally bright. Then, this story really happened, but it ended so abruptly. She saw the television and ran to the square. She saw him smiling under the sun. Then, she saw the black bag being pushed into the ambulance and began to cry. She did not know who he was, what he did, why he had to meet her. She did not know why she cried so sadly. Her name was Huang Li, a nurse in the Army General Hospital. She was a very kind girl. Her name was Zhou, the mother of his child. Above, you're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.